When a nurse from the Cherokee Nation meets a charming Southern gentleman, sparks fly.
He was a golfer. He was a pilot. He'd gone to Ohio State and played football with Woody Hayes.
But is it all smoke and mirrors?
My husband says, I'm not real sure about that guy. I was in horror. I couldn't speak. This is something that you would see on 2020. This doesn't happen to us.
Questions about his past come back to haunt Deborah Proctor.
The reason why he went missing was there was a barn fire. They never found any remains.
He would do anything for me. And I thought maybe he murdered someone.
I was afraid he would burn the place down. I was frightened at this point.
And when a cold case is reopened, Deborah's marriage goes up in flames.
It was just a nightmare.
It was like, who are you? How have you done these things? Tahlequah is the heart of the Cherokee Reservation. My father was originally sent here in the early 30s. He and his siblings were sent to boarding school. I personally have lived at 4 boarding schools, and most of my years was spent at Seneca Indian School.
Deborah does well in school and graduates from nursing college. She then goes back to work in her community.
Everybody knows Deb. She's always out in the public. Very kind, very sweet. Always, always out to help anybody and everybody. You know, she's a very good-hearted lady.
I'm very active in my community, and it's just a celebration of the Cherokee. It can be community activities, friendships, concerts, might be birthdays. There are the powwows, there's the parade, there's tournaments, softball, golf. We love golf. I've been playing golf a while, years and years.
Deborah has spent almost her entire life on the reservation, and even married and then divorced a local non-native man. In 1998, she's single with 2 sons when she decides to broaden her horizons by posting a dating profile online.
I had hoped for a long-term relationship. I wasn't looking to move, but if someone was free to move here, that was an option for me. I met a number of gentlemen, but the one that seemed the most appealing to me, his name was Jeff Walton. Jeff's profile shared of all the things he had done in his life. He was a golfer, he was a pilot, he was a project manager for large industry, construction. He'd gone to Ohio State and played football with Woody Hayes.
They exchange messages, and he tells her that he had been married and divorced once and has 1 son. When they finally talk on the phone, Deborah is charmed.
His favorite word was darling, in a New Orleans accent. I just thought that was amazing. When he began to talk about Native American music, I think I was just gone at that point. I was like, this guy really gets me.
3 months into their online relationship, Jeff tells Deborah that business is bringing him to Oklahoma. It's time to meet.
I had a big event planned. I was having my family over, and I was having dinner, and I'd fixed dessert, and, just doing a home welcome. Here's my family, welcome to Tahlequah, that kind of thing. Everyone came but Jeff.
Jeff is a no-show.
Well, I was sick at my stomach. And then he reached out in an email, and that's when he explained what all had happened. His mother had called him home to Canada. His brother John was missing. The family was worried about him, and he just had to go home. I just felt such compassion for them that he was missing.
I've known Deb a long time. She is a good judge of character. I felt cautious, but I also felt happy for Deb. She told me all about him. She showed me pictures. She was just happy as could be.
When Jeff's brother returns, with little explanation, Jeff is ready to carry on where he and Deborah left off.
He came here on April 23rd, 1998. I went to visit a medicine man, and I did have him bead a feather. Then I gave that to Jeff when I picked him up at the airport. It's a part of my culture. I was very nervous, very nervous. It's scary, because I'd been single a number of years. You know, I really loved this guy, and I'd never met him. And our first weekend together, I took him all around, introduced him to as many friends as I could, took him to my golf course. Everyone was friendly. Even my guy friends were friendly. It was beautiful. It was very lovely. My boys, they liked him. He's a very personable guy. And one of my dearest golf friends was like, well, you know, I'm not sure that you know yet, do you? And I go, oh yeah, this is the one.
He was handsome. He was kind. He had that New Orleans drawl. He treated her like a princess. In fact, he called her my Indian princess.
Katie's husband, Jesse, isn't as impressed.
We hug each other here. And they gave each other a hug.
And then Jeff does an odd thing.
Well, Jeff put Jesse in a headlock. No one was looking. And so, you know, I was just thinking, why would he do that? Well, later on, Jesse told me he hurt him because his back's jacked up. And then he said something to him like, oh, you sissy, or something.
Later, Jeff reveals another surprising side of himself that Deborah had been unaware of when he goes to dinner with Deborah and her sons.
And something came up about him being a veteran, and he told both my sons. He said, I will let you ask me one question about my being a veteran, about being in the Vietnam War. We began to learn about the prisoner of war story and the horrors of it. They were ambushed, his unit, and he was captured, and they took a gun butt and busted his feet, and he was able to finally get free and followed water back to American troops. I just thought he was a phenomenal man with all that he had done in his life. There was an annual trip that we typically made right after Christmas, and I typically would travel with all my golf couples. And so finally I was like, now I have a golf partner.
4 couples, including Jeff and Deborah, travel to Florida to play golf. But there's a small problem.
He didn't bring his golf clubs. A real golfer is not going to lose their clubs. But he said his was taken. So we bought him all new clubs. 8 of you can't play together, so we always played in different groups.
The guys play together on the first day, and Jeff stuns Deborah when he wins the tournament and a pot of money. But he's the only one happy about it.
I noticed that there was a strangeness. There was a distance, and these were my close friends. I've traveled with them for years, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I learned that what happened, and they were just observing cheating. And they witnessed that. He might not count all of his strokes, or if he hit out of bounds, he wouldn't take his penalty shot. And if you cheat, that says a lot about you.
Deborah turns to her best friend Katie for advice.
She was crying. She was upset because they were bad-mouthing Jeff, which made me upset. They just didn't like his personality. They didn't like to be around him.
After we made that trip to Florida, that we weren't invited anymore, that was the end of our couples traveling out of state every year.
Despite this, Jeff decides to leave his home and contractor job in Kentucky to live with Deborah in Oklahoma.
He expressed that he liked it here, and we began to talk about him moving. That was the next plan that we talked about. I was just really committed. You know, we'll find work for you. I was just all in, fully committed. I just felt so warm in his presence, you know. I just felt such love in my heart for him.
3 months after they first met, Jeff arrives in Oklahoma, and Deborah rushes to the airport.
It was a little late, so he was already off the plane and out into the big common area. And his voice was kind of shaking. And so I was like, well, I guess he's really scared, you know. I would be too. He's really taken a big step, giving up everything. Of course, he's probably a little frightened, you know. But I remember his voice shaking a little bit, and he just said, you're going to marry me. You're marrying me, right? Looking back at that very moment that he came here, it's like the darkness came in the door.
I was in horror. I couldn't speak. This is something that you would see on 2020. This doesn't happen to us.
He was brilliant, you know, an evil brilliant.
Deborah Proctor's boyfriend Jeff has surprised her with an impromptu proposal.
You know, I wanted to be married, and I was very happy about it. We just wanted a small, intimate ceremony in Eureka Springs, a couple of hours from here. His son, little Jeff, and daughter-in-law came. I was so happy to meet his family, just thrilled. At the time, Dustin, my oldest son, was living in Fort Worth, Dallas, and he just said they weren't able to make it. And so that was a bit painful to my heart. My youngest son, Derek, was there, and he walked me down. It was April 23rd, 2000 we married, and that was 2 years to the date that we'd actually met in person the first time. Jeff, he had the usual smile and seemed to enjoy and engage in the day. I just went right on like I would normally go, except now I had a partner and a husband to go with me. Immediately I went to work trying to help him get work, and a friend gave him a job, and he didn't keep that longer than 3 days. He came home and he just said that it really wasn't what I was looking for, and I was like, oh, well, that's disappointing, but it's okay, something will work out.
In March 2004, Jeff redeems himself when he lands his best contract yet for a construction job at a prison in North Carolina.
I was very excited about it. I was just going to give up everything. I gave notice of 2 or 3 months.
It's a big step for Deborah, who is a hospital nurse and the director of a healthcare clinic. But just before she's ready to leave, she gets a call from Jeff.
And he said that there was another contractor. He got upset with Jeff over something and kind of approached him like he was going to hit him, and Jeff said, I told him, you're picking on the wrong guy. He said he didn't stop, so I took him out. He said, I broke his teeth. He said, Deb, there's no tolerance. It doesn't matter that he attacked me, there's just no tolerance. So he lost that job. You know, this was a great job. I was moving out there. I'd already given notice. I was going to finish a different degree at Duke. I was pretty excited.
Deborah rescinds her notice, but it's hard to turn a blind eye to Jeff's violent outburst.
And at that point, I was like, I don't know. I think I'm just done. I can't. What is this work stuff? How can you mess this up? I talked to my closest friend, Katie. By this time, everyone liked Jeff. They just felt like, you know, I needed to help pack him up and move him home, that there wasn't anything he could do if he was being attacked, that he warned the guy.
I mean, we just made excuses for him. That's what honest, loving people do, I think, that can't see evil in people. Deb can't see evil in people.
But the stressful ordeal takes a physical toll on Deborah.
And when we came back, I was just deathly ill. But I'm such a such a fighter and a push on, I just didn't pay attention. By the time we got home late morning, I was like, I can't breathe. You have to take me into the hospital. And of course, I was a nurse at the hospital at that time, so the crowds were gathering. You know, everyone was very concerned.
Everyone but Jeff, who goes home. Deborah is so sick with pneumonia that she's unaware he's left her side.
I ended up having to go on life support.
He was absent. He wasn't there. He never called. You know, it was an hour by hour, is she going to make it? My husband would have been right there by my bedside.
I think it was 9 days and 6 or 7 on life support. My friends were just furious that he left me. When I kind of came around, they were all still very angry that he would just walk out not knowing if I was going to live or die.
Deb bounces back quickly and forgives Jeff for his absence, but her friends think she should walk away from the relationship.
I didn't feel like I was making excuses. I felt like they just didn't understand.
Over time, most of Deborah's friends forgive Jeff, who is suitably remorseful, and he finally settles into his new life in Oklahoma.
When he did locate employment, it was typically good. He might have to travel to Arkansas or Tulsa or Bartlesville from here, but, you know, he made a good living at times.
But before long, another shoe drops.
Somehow, IRS bills arrived, and I was like, what's this about, Jeff? I didn't know you owed thousands of dollars to the IRS. You probably should have told me that. And he said, well, we're still fighting it. I was just angry. Oh, here was this enormous tax bill that he didn't tell me he owed, but there wasn't any way around it. We had to pay it.
In January 2003, Deborah and Jeff finally receive welcome news. It's his mother Dot's 80th birthday, and they are invited to a party in Edmonton, Alberta.
He'd been in my life for 5 years, and I'd never met anybody in his family except little Jeff. So that's when we flew to Canada for the birthday party.
Jeff's Canadian family has a completely different surname, Stan, not Walton.
Jeff told me that he was born in Alaska. Sometime in grade school that they moved to Canada, and that's why his name was different. He had a different dad. But in 2003 when we went, just his mother was alive, and I met his sister Wendy. She's just got to be a great human. And then his brothers, 2 brothers, Alan and John.
Deborah is also about to meet a man named Dave Semple, a law enforcement officer who is attending the party for Dorothy Stan as well.
In 2003, my mother called and said that there was an 80th birthday party for Dot and suggested that I go up and represent the family. The birthday party was in an apartment building where his mother lived. By the time I got there and got out of my car and started walking towards the building, and I saw 2 guys walking towards me, and I saw that big toothy grin, but I recognized it right away. I said, Ronnie Stan, that's got to be you. Well, hey, I was your closest friend back in 1947, and he recognized me then and gave me a great big bear hug. And that's when he said, I'm not Ronnie Stan. My name is Jeff Walton.
If Dave looks like he's seen a ghost, it's because the man who Dave Semple knew as Ronnie Stan died in a barn fire in 1977.
There was a bunch of pigs that were in the barn that died. The fire department and the OPP did an investigation. Everybody just assumed that he had died. And the intense fire, it rendered everything right to dust.
Now Ronnie Stan has risen from the dead with a different name, Jeff Walton. But why is Jeff's family keeping Deborah in the dark?
Double lives are fascinating. We all wonder if we've met somebody who has some kind of secret life behind them.
I didn't want to see it. I thought he was a good guy.
3 years after marrying Jeff, Deborah Proctor finally meets his mom at her 80th birthday party in Canada.
I was so happy to meet his family, just thrilled. And we all just hit it off famously. Was happy to meet Dave, a childhood friend.
She is unaware that everyone at the party, including his family, knows Jeff by another name and are colluding to keep it from her. Jeff asks Dave not to tell Deborah, and he obliges out of loyalty.
I'd always called him Ron, and now all of a sudden to have to catch myself and call him Jeff, so I basically tried not to call him anything at all. There's a lot of questions running around in my head, but wasn't time to be asking anything at that point. I just sort of glad to see him again.
She's so delighted to meet Jeff's Canadian family. Deborah doesn't notice any awkwardness.
Had no idea. None. And they all called him Jeff.
His family. They stick together. They were just happy as heck to have him back. Made the family complete again. After talking to his mom and to his brothers and sisters on that very, very first night, I was satisfied that there was nothing that was, there was no wrongdoing. He had simply disappeared.
But the story of how Ronnie Stan became a fugitive and what crimes he may have committed while on the run is far from simple. What Jeff's friends and family know, and what Deborah won't find out for another 10 years, is that back in 1977, Ronnie Stan was married to a woman named Gail and had 2 children.
He was living in southwestern Ontario in the 1970s. He was working as a teacher at Fanshawe College. He also had a farm. So he was working on the farm at night, and by day he was teaching. He had become involved with a student. It's not good to be involved with a student at any time, but especially if you're married with children. This student told her mother that she was going to marry Ronald Stan. And her mother phoned his mother, and his mother told him, "You're in big trouble. She's from a very rich and powerful family." So on that day, his whole world was going to come apart. There just happened to be a fire which presented an opportunity. He's sitting there in the field, and he can hear his wife screaming as she sees the barn burning, knowing that he was supposed to be in there feeding the pigs. He had $3,000 that was in his pocket, and under the cover of night, he hopped on a bus and crossed the border and decided to go to New Orleans.
Initially, Ron's family presumes that he died in the fire with the pigs and are unaware that he now adopts a new identity.
So Ron Stan decided to change his name to Jeff Walton. Jeff was after the son he abandoned in Ontario, and Walton was after the television show The Waltons because he thought it was a nice, friendly American family name. And in his words, he had to find someone with a little bit of money to marry, and the woman that he found was Roseanne. He described her as a beautiful young woman from a well-to-do family in New Orleans.
Jeff tells Roseanne his family died in a plane crash in Alaska. But when the two start talking marriage the following year, there's a snag.
Jeff Walton, he didn't have a birth certificate. So they went to another county where you didn't need a birth certificate to get a marriage license, and they got married there. And he was clearly still married to Gail, his Canadian wife.
He told me that he wound up getting married and having a child with her, little Jeff.
My first impression of Roseanne was she seemed like a very nice woman who had a very bad relationship with Jeff Walton. In her words, she said he could charm a snake. Roseanne got in some kind of a car accident with a commercial vehicle, and there was a lawsuit with a settlement of $500,000. Roseanne said that Jeff spent a lot of money on booze and women and partying in New Orleans.
He wound up divorcing her, and she said then he wound up marrying a Playboy bunny. And again, I figured, well, that's really, but that turned out to be true.
Jeff Walton's second wife, or Ron Stan's third wife, is Holly Kelly.
I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Playboy came into town, and I wanted to get into Playboy. I thought it was very classy, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. They ended up taking about 5,000 pictures of me, which I always wondered what in the world happened to the negatives.
Holly's living in New Orleans in the 1990s when her friends say there is someone they'd like her to meet.
Jeff was charming. We hit it off great. He had everything that you could ever imagine, you know. I mean, he had the looks, he had the charm, he had money. You know, that helps.
Holly knows her new boyfriend Jeff is still technically married, but Jeff no longer lives with Roseanne and little Jeff. What Holly doesn't know is if he has any other living relatives, including other wives.
I know that Jeff started reaching out to his family in Canada in the early 90s. I don't know if they were actively searching for him. He had been declared dead.
In 1993, Jeff divorces Roseanne and marries Holly.
It was a beautiful, beautiful wedding, beautiful day. I did want to marry Jeff beyond a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I loved Jeff. I mean, he really was a great guy. None of us knew that he had just been lying about his entire life the whole time. I mean, we just totally fell for what he was telling us. He would do anything for me, except tell the truth. Yeah. He told my father that he was in Vietnam. I guess it was to impress my father, because my father was a Marine in World War II, Iwo Jima. You question yourself because you think, you know, am I nuts? He was very, very smart. He would cover it up somehow. Somehow he would make it believable.
And Holly did believe in Jeff until the day the phone rang and it was a call from Canada.
His brother called and said, you know, we've been looking for Jeff. And when he got home from work, hey, somebody called and said they were your family from Canada. And you know, I mean, his face turned white as a sheet. And I thought maybe he murdered someone. What was so horrible that you would have to do this? It's just, no words.
In 1990, Jeff Walton's third wife, Holly Kelly, learns that everything he told her and her parents about his life is a lie.
I had to go tell my mother and father all of this, that this guy that they thought was Jeff Walton, his name's Ron Stan. The question is where do you take it from there? I knew at that point that it was over, and he did too.
More than 20 years later, his fourth wife, Deborah Proctor, remains ignorant of his past. But a lifetime of lies seems to be catching up with Jeff.
Jeff had had a number of hospitalizations. One was hemorrhaging, and they felt like he had bladder cancer, and I never left his side. And then he said, Deb, I'm not feeling right. My eyesight's really blurry. I'm not making sense with my words. And I took him in, and he had a stroke. So I was just trying to pay for everything.
On the verge of bankruptcy, Deborah asks Jeff to access his veterans' health benefits, but he refuses.
I said, you don't understand. We have nothing left. And that's when he informed me, I'm not going to the Veterans for Care. And besides that, I was in Special Forces. I did have a dishonorable discharge. And so they're not even going to have a list of me at the Veterans. They're not going to see me, and I'm not going anyway. And I remember at the time feeling like my throat was closing and my heart was heavy, and I thought, something's not right. It's just not right. I thought maybe I should get a private investigator. Anyway, I didn't. I do think it was about that time that I did go into what I would say is a severe depression. I was sad. I'd be somewhere in the house by myself, but just sobbing and crying and just saying, I hate my life. August 1st, 2014, I was just in my office and a phone rang, and I picked up this particular phone call. And he identified himself, his badge numbers, and he was in OPP, Ontario Provincial Police. He said, well, we have reason to believe that you're married to Ron Stan. We have reason to believe that he is a man that burned his place down 37 years ago and left a newborn son and a toddler and a wife. I was in so much shock, disbelief. And when we hung up, I called my friends. They said, well, for God's sake, your life's probably in danger. We have to go out to the Cherokee Nation Marshal Service, and we have to get some help. So that's what we did.
She was really confused. This man that she had been with for at least 14, 15 years was possibly not the man he'd been saying he was. I contacted Canada. I spoke to a female officer, and she said, yes. We opened up cold cases, and we came across his and started working on it again.
The officer said they found him by examining the social media pages of his various family members.
And we were shocked that we actually found him on Facebook. They explained that the reason why he went missing was there was a barn fire. And apparently he was in the barn fire, but they never found any remains. The case just kind of sat for years because they had no clue, and nothing ever surfaced again. And they asked me at that time, they said, if you don't mind, could you interview him and see what he says? We're trying to figure out if this is him or not.
Shauna drives to the medical facility where Jeff is staying while he recovers from his stroke and meets him in a private room.
I proceeded on to explain to him that I had received a call from Canada police. So I eventually told him, I was like, do you at least have your birth certificate? Do you have your birth certificate so I can see? And he said, yes. And I said, well, where's it at? Well, I don't know. I can't remember where. And I said, well, that's okay. I said, I'll ask my dispatcher to get a copy of your birth certificate. And he looked at me. He just started grinning. He said, you got me, didn't you? And I said, you have kids and a wife in Canada? And he said, yes, I do. He was using a deceased individual's Social Security number and was getting Oklahoma benefits off the Social Security number for at least 20 years. He was a very good con. I felt so sorry for Deb once I got the confession from him.
Wasn't any getting around it. That was the truth. Just shocking. I didn't imagine anything like this. I couldn't talk to Jeff. What was I going to say? You're a liar? But, I had to plan. I mean, how am I going to tell my boys? How am I going to tell his boy?
She was very, very upset, and I could certainly understand why.
I was grateful for my friends, and we just started making plans. Well, we got to go to the bank. We got to get with your attorney. We were able to get a quick claim deed and a quick divorce, and our tribe's domestic violence program helped me. They helped serve the papers because I just couldn't do it.
Jeff Jr. agrees to take custody of his father.
I was just really angry. I was frightened at this point that, he might hurt us. Because now I'd learned he burned the place down.
It was just a nightmare, and you feel so stupid. The time I spent with him was not quality time, it was all fake time. I just hated him.
I'm at home alone in my bedroom when I got the call that they had left Tahlequah, they were on the road. People talk about spiritual awakenings or a burning bush moment or something. For me, it was absolutely that moment. And I realized I couldn't get up. I couldn't move. And then I thought, dear God, if you can just get me up on my feet, I will not only survive, but I will always remember to help others. Was just a profound understanding of what I'd been through and what I had yet to do.
I think it was a couple of days after that I had a conversation with Jeff. I think he was kind of somewhat relieved about the whole thing, coming out in the open after all these years.
An Ontario man who went missing in the 70s and was declared dead in the 80s has been found in the United States alive. Police say the 69-year-old has been living in Oklahoma under a different name.
Once it came out, it just snowballed.
Deborah is about to learn the full extent of Jeff's lies, and it makes her ordeal even more unbearable.
And that's when I learned about all the wives.
For 37 years, Ronald Stan has been living under a fake identity in the U.S. In 2014, the Ontario police issue a press release about the case.
This story landed on my desk, and it said a man named Ronald Stan, who was missing in 1977, has been found alive and well in the United States, which was a crazy story. Like, what happened there?
Tim Elemenchuk finds Jeff in New Orleans, where he is now living with his son Jeff Jr., and he agrees to an interview.
He had this kind of unmistakable charm that I could see disarming somebody. Every successive wife would eventually find out about his past, and his stories would just fall apart and wouldn't quite hang together. But he had this capacity to charm people off the hop and to get people to kind of not dig deeper into his history.
He just was a pathological liar. Only a narcissist person could do something like that, to make people think you're dead and to leave your children and never call them.
I don't think he was actually a very good liar, and that's evidenced by how his story fell apart along the way. And when you look into it and when you talk to people, his family knew that he was alive. His brother had contact with him on Facebook.
Even his Canadian wife, Gail, eventually found out about his lies in 1998 when he shows up at his dad's funeral.
He said that his wife was at the funeral and that she wouldn't even look at him. As far as I know, he never spoke with Gail again.
Ron had been declared legally dead in 1986, and Gail had received an insurance payout.
He explained to me later on that insurance money that his first wife had got. Once he contacted her, she was quite PO'd about the whole thing and paid the money back to the insurance company. So there's no fraud or anything there.
His father's funeral may have been a time when he realized that he can't undo what he did in 1977. And so in reaction to that, that might have been what spurred looking for another new life.
Deborah never talks to Jeff again.
I was sitting in one of the airports and I saw that he was calling, and it just went to voicemail. And he said that he had forgiven me for everything I'd done to him. And at this point, I was just done. I just could hardly even react. I just couldn't stand him.
Months later, Deborah speaks to his old friend Dave Semple, who explains why he never told her the truth.
He just explained that we had a good life, we seemed happy, and they just did not feel like it was their place to fly in here and tell me everything and destroy my life. I myself submitted letters to HHS, fraud, abuse. I think I wrote 3 different divisions of Medicare and Social Security and let them know who Jeff really was. And as far as I know, nobody ever pursued it.
Jeff never faces criminal charges for arson, identity theft, bigamy, or any of his misadventures. But his life goes downhill after his divorce from Deborah.
I don't know what happened there, but he wound up, I think, living almost a homeless life for a while. And then the next I heard from little Jeff, that I think it was 2019, that his dad had just passed away.
Jeff may have left behind a trail of damaged lives, but Deborah transcended his betrayal, although it took her some time.
I just went through a lot of periods of just being furious, angry, turn it on myself sometimes, how could you? And then resentful at all the best years of my life I'd spent with him. The job that I've moved into, it is the focus entirely, is domestic abuse, family abuse, particularly women, but families. I'm a director of a program that's our total focus. And I feel like it's fulfilling a commitment I made right after this happened, that I would always help others in this situation. Because we can go on to not only survive, we can live. And I feel like I live. Not just a survivor, I live. That's what I would want for others. We're warrior women. We're very strong.
On February 26, 1984, 19-year-old Donna Macho disappeared from the East Windsor, New Jersey, home where she lived with her parents and sisters. There was no dramatic warning, no public confrontation, no final message announcing that something terrible was about to happen. She simply vanished. And for the people who loved her, that disappearance became the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. Donna was 19. She worked as a legal secretary. She hoped to build a career in modeling. She was young, ambitious, and still at the beginning of her adult life. Then, in a single day, that future disappeared with her. At first, her family did not know whether she was dead. That uncertainty would become one of the cruelest parts of the case. For years, there was no body, no grave, no final goodbye. Only questions. Where had Donna gone? Who had taken her? Was she alive somewhere? Had she been abducted? Had someone she knew been involved? Every possibility had to be considered. And every possibility meant another day of waiting. The investigation began in East Windsor. Police searched. They interviewed people. They followed leads. They tried to understand how a 19-year-old woman could disappear from her own community without leaving behind a clear explanation. But the case did not produce the answer investigators needed. Donna remained missing. Months became years. Years became a decade, and then another. The family refused to let her disappear from public memory. They searched for her. They hired private investigators. They used trackers. They even turned to psychics. They spent money they could not afford to spend because uncertainty was impossible to accept. Donna's sister Julie Berger was only 14 when Donna disappeared. Decades later, she would describe what the disappearance had done to the family. The searching. The wondering. The constant question of whether Donna might somehow still be alive. That hope could not simply be switched off. Because, without a body, there was always another possibility. Maybe she had been taken somewhere. Maybe she was being held. Maybe she had survived. The family had to live inside that uncertainty. Then, 11 years after Donna vanished, the case changed forever. On April 2nd, 1995, a Boy Scout troop leader discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area in Cranberry, New Jersey. The discovery was shocking. But at first, the remains did not answer the most important question. Who was this person? Dental records eventually provided the answer. The remains belonged to Donna Macho. After 11 years, the family finally knew what had happened to her. Donna was dead. The mystery was no longer a missing person case. It was a homicide investigation. And the discovery created a new set of questions. Who had killed her? Where had she been taken? Why had her body been left in that wooded area? And how had she remained unidentified for so long? Investigators returned to the old case. They looked again at the evidence. They revisited people who had been considered persons of interest, and one name stood out: Nathaniel Harvey. Harvey had been identified early in the investigation as a possible suspect. The reason was significant. Around the time Donna disappeared, Harvey was involved in a series of serious crimes. Authorities later described a pattern in which he entered unlocked homes and held young women captive. But despite the suspicion surrounding him, the investigation did not produce enough evidence to charge him in Donna's death. The leads faded. The case went cold. And Donna's family was left waiting again. This time, they knew she was dead, but they still did not know who had killed her. Harvey's own criminal history would later become extensive. He was eventually convicted in connection with other serious crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1985 rape and murder of a Plainsboro woman. He remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. But Donna's murder remained unresolved. That fact is critical. Harvey was in prison. Donna's killer had not been conclusively identified. The years continued to pass. Inside the evidence room, the case existed as old files, old reports, old statements, and physical evidence collected from a crime that had happened more than a decade earlier. Outside, Donna's family continued living with the consequences. Her sister grew older. Her parents grew older. The world changed. Technology changed. The investigation did not. At least, not yet. Then forensic science began to change the meaning of old evidence. DNA technology had advanced dramatically since the 1980s and 1990s. Evidence that once could not identify a person could now potentially produce a genetic profile. That possibility gave investigators a reason to reopen Donna's case. The bedroom where Donna had disappeared from became especially important. Evidence from the room had previously produced no definitive identification. But modern testing could examine that evidence again. Investigators submitted it for new DNA analysis. The results were extraordinary. The DNA belonged to Nathaniel Harvey. According to New Jersey authorities, his DNA was the only DNA evidence found in the room that should not have been there. Suddenly, the old suspicion had something it had never possessed before: scientific evidence. The case had spent decades trapped inside uncertainty. Now modern forensic technology had created a direct connection. Donna's killer had not been erased by time. The evidence had survived. And the person investigators had once considered a possible suspect had left something behind. Something microscopic. Something invisible to investigators decades earlier. Something that could finally speak. Harvey was already dead. He had died in Southwood State Prison in November 2020. That meant there would be no dramatic arrest. No interrogation room. No handcuffs. No courtroom confrontation with Donna's family. The man authorities identified as responsible for Donna's murder was already gone. But death did not prevent investigators from establishing the truth. In 2023, the New Jersey Attorney General's Office and the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office announced what they described as the conclusive identification of Nathaniel Harvey as the person responsible for Donna's sexual assault and murder. The announcement brought an end to decades of uncertainty. But it also revealed something disturbing. The suspect had been visible years earlier. Investigators had considered him. His name had entered the case. But the evidence needed to establish his responsibility did not exist in a form investigators could use. The technology was not there. The case went cold. Donna remained dead. Her family remained without an answer. And Harvey continued serving a life sentence for another homicide. The truth was still buried. Not only in the woods where Donna's remains were found, but inside evidence that would remain silent for years. That is what makes the case so haunting. The breakthrough did not come from a mysterious confession. It did not come from a dramatic stranger appearing at a police station. It did not come from a family secret suddenly exposed. It came from science. A tiny biological trace. Evidence collected decades earlier. Evidence that investigators could not fully exploit at the time. And when modern technology finally examined it, the past became impossible to ignore. The DNA pointed toward Harvey. Then investigators had to determine whether the rest of the evidence supported the connection.
It did.
Donna's vehicle had been found abandoned near a sewer plant. That location was within walking distance of Harvey's residence. Her remains were found in a wooded area near a farm where Harvey had briefly worked around the time she disappeared. Those details did not stand alone. The DNA evidence was the critical breakthrough. But the locations created a disturbing geographic connection. Donna had vanished. Her vehicle had been abandoned. Her body had eventually been found. And the man authorities identified decades later had connections to the places surrounding those events. The original investigators had not been able to close the case. The modern investigators could see the picture differently. The technology had changed. The evidence had not. Donna's family had spent decades searching for an answer. Now they finally had one. But the answer came with a painful reality. The person responsible had already been imprisoned for years. And he had died before the truth about Donna's murder was officially established. There would be no trial. No verdict. No sentence specifically for Donna. Only an official conclusion. Nathaniel Harvey was responsible. The family had finally been given the truth. But truth and justice are not always the same thing. For Donna's sister, the emotional cost of those decades could never be erased. She had been 14 when her sister disappeared. For years, she did not know whether Donna was alive. The family searched. They hoped. They spent money. They followed possibilities. They lived with uncertainty. Then, in 1995, the remains were found. Hope became grief. And even then, the most important question remained unanswered. Who did this? The answer would take another 28 years. That is the timeline that makes Donna Macho's case so difficult to comprehend. She disappeared in 1984. Her remains were discovered in 1995. The man ultimately identified as responsible died in 2020. And only in 2023 did investigators publicly announce the DNA-based conclusion. Nearly 4 decades separated the crime from the final identification. 4 decades in which Donna's name remained connected to an unanswered question. 4 decades in which her family had to continue living. And 4 decades in which the evidence waited. That is the true power of a cold case. The clock stops for no one. The victim cannot wait. The family cannot wait. But evidence sometimes can. A biological trace can survive. A document can survive. A photograph can survive. A forgotten object can survive. And when technology catches up with the evidence, a case that appeared permanently frozen can suddenly move. Donna's case is a reminder that time does not necessarily destroy every answer. Sometimes it hides the answer. Sometimes it takes decades before investigators have the tools to see it. And sometimes the most important clue is not something discovered today. It is something collected long ago. Something investigators touched. Something they photographed. Something they stored. Something they could not understand. Until science finally gave it a voice. Donna Macho disappeared as a 19-year-old woman with plans for her future. She was not a headline. She was not a case number. She was a daughter. A sister. A young woman hoping to build a career. Then someone took her life. For decades, her family had to live without knowing who. Now they know. The evidence finally answered the question that had haunted them since 1984. And the answer had been waiting inside the case all along. The answer had been waiting inside the case all along. But an answer discovered decades later does not erase the years that came before it. For Donna Macho's family, the most painful part of the story was not simply that she had been murdered. It was that for 11 years, they did not even know whether she was alive. That uncertainty began on February 26, 1984. Donna was 19 years old. She was living with her parents and sisters in East Windsor, New Jersey. She worked as a legal secretary. She was also pursuing another dream: modeling. She had plans. She had a future. And nothing about that February day suggested that her life was about to disappear. Then she was gone. The first hours after a disappearance are critical. Every minute matters. Investigators need to establish the last confirmed sighting, the last phone call, the last known destination, the people who had contact with the missing person, the vehicle, the clothing, the places she was expected to be. Every detail can become important. But in Donna's case, the central question remained painfully simple. Where was she? The family needed an answer. Police needed an answer. And the longer that answer remained out of reach, the more frightening the possibilities became. There was no body. No confirmed crime scene. No definitive proof that Donna had been killed. That meant investigators had to work within the uncertainty of a missing person investigation. People disappear for many reasons. Some leave voluntarily. Some are victims of accidents. Some are abducted. Some are killed. Investigators cannot assume the answer. They have to establish it. For Donna's family, however, there was no waiting patiently for the investigation to resolve itself. They searched. They asked questions. They followed leads. They tried anything that might bring her home. Years later, her sister Julie Berger would remember the desperation of that period. The family hired private investigators. They used trackers. They consulted psychics. They followed possibilities that offered even the smallest chance of finding Donna. That is what desperation does. It makes every possibility feel worth pursuing. A stranger claiming to have seen Donna. A rumor. A supposed sighting. A suggestion that she might have left the area. Each one could create hope. And each failed lead could destroy it. The family had no choice but to continue. Because there was still a possibility. Maybe Donna was somewhere. Maybe she was alive. Maybe she would come home. Then 11 years passed. By 1995, the disappearance had become one of those cases that seemed trapped in time. Donna had vanished in 1984. The world had changed since then. Technology had changed. People had moved. Memories had faded. But Donna's family still did not have an answer. Then came the discovery that changed everything. On April 2nd, 1995, a Boy Scout troop leader found human skeletal remains in a wooded area of Cranberry. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. Investigators now had something they had never had before: a body. But a body is not automatically an identity. The remains had to be examined. Investigators needed to determine who the person was. Dental records eventually provided the answer. The remains belonged to Donna. The missing person case had become a homicide. The family finally knew she was dead. But knowing that was not the same as knowing who killed her. That question remained. And now investigators had a location. The woods in Cranberry became part of the story. But the place where Donna's remains were found was not necessarily the place where she had been killed. That distinction mattered. A body can be transported. A crime can begin somewhere else. Investigators had to reconstruct the path. Where had Donna been before she disappeared? Where had her vehicle been? Where could she have encountered the person responsible? How had her body reached Cranberry? The investigation had to move backward. From the discovery site. To the victim. To her final movements. To the people around her. And eventually, toward a suspect. That suspect had already appeared in the investigation years earlier. Nathaniel Harvey. His name had not come from nowhere. Harvey had been identified as a person of interest during the investigation. His criminal history would later become deeply significant. He had been connected to serious crimes involving women. In 1985, he was convicted in the rape and murder of a woman in Plainsboro. He received a life sentence. He remained imprisoned. But even after Harvey was convicted of another murder, the evidence required to establish that he had killed Donna did not exist. That distinction is crucial. A violent criminal history can make investigators look harder. It cannot, by itself, prove responsibility for another homicide. Police needed evidence connecting Harvey specifically to Donna. Without that connection, the case remained open. Donna's family had a body. They had an identity. But they did not have accountability. And then the case went quiet again. The years became decades. Harvey remained behind bars. Donna's family continued living with the unanswered question. The investigation became a cold case. But cold did not mean forgotten. Behind every cold case is a family that still remembers. For Donna's family, the disappearance had become part of their lives. Her absence had been there through birthdays, through holidays, through marriages, through children growing up, through parents aging. There is no normal way to grieve when the truth is missing. If someone dies and the family knows how, there is at least an ending. A funeral.
A grave.
A final moment. But when someone disappears, grief has no clear boundary. Hope can survive for years. And hope can become painful. The discovery of Donna's remains ended one uncertainty. It created another. She was dead. But who killed her? That question remained. Then forensic science began to change the possibilities. DNA technology had developed dramatically since the 1980s. Evidence that once could not provide an identification could now potentially reveal a person's genetic profile. Cold case investigators began revisiting old evidence across the country. Old murders were being reconsidered. Old samples were being tested. Old assumptions were being challenged. Donna's case became one of them. Investigators returned to evidence collected decades earlier. The goal was straightforward. Find something that could connect Donna's murder to a specific person. The bedroom became important. Donna had disappeared from her family's home. Evidence associated with the room had been preserved. At the time, investigators had limited ability to interpret biological traces. Decades later, modern testing offered another opportunity. The evidence was submitted for DNA analysis. What came back changed the investigation. The DNA belonged to Nathaniel Harvey. According to the New Jersey Attorney General's office, Harvey was the only person whose DNA was found in the room and who should not have been there. That statement transformed the case. For decades, Harvey had been a person of interest. Now investigators had forensic evidence connecting him to the location where Donna had disappeared. The old suspicion had acquired a scientific foundation. And that was the moment the case finally began moving toward resolution. But even then, investigators had to proceed carefully. DNA can be powerful evidence, but a forensic result still has to be interpreted within the circumstances of a case. Investigators needed to establish why Harvey's DNA was there. Was there a legitimate explanation? Could he have been in the house for another reason? Was the evidence consistent with the theory of the crime? The surrounding facts mattered. And investigators found more. Donna's vehicle had been discovered abandoned near a sewer plant. The location was within walking distance of Harvey's residence. That fact did not prove murder, but it added context. Investigators also determined that Harvey had briefly worked at a farm near the area where Donna's remains were eventually found. Again, that fact alone did not establish guilt. But cold cases are rarely solved by one fact in isolation. Investigators assemble the pieces. DNA. Location.
Timeline.
Criminal history. Witness information. Prior investigative leads. Each piece has to be examined. Each has to be weighed. The goal is to determine whether they tell the same story. In Donna's case, the pieces began converging. The man whose name had appeared in the original investigation was now connected to the case by modern forensic evidence. And the geography placed him within the broader area surrounding Donna's disappearance and the eventual discovery of her remains. The investigation had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer simply asking, could Harvey have been involved? It was asking, what does the evidence establish? But there was a problem that no forensic test could solve. Harvey was dead. He had died in November 2020 at Southwood State Prison. The man investigators identified as responsible for Donna's death would never stand trial for it. There would be no interrogation, no confession, No courtroom. No cross-examination. No jury. No sentence. The resolution would have to come through the evidence. And that made the DNA discovery even more important, because science was now doing what a living suspect never could. It was allowing investigators to establish a connection after the suspect was gone. Donna's family could not confront Harvey, but they could finally hear the conclusion from investigators. After decades of uncertainty, the New Jersey Attorney General's office and the Mercer County Prosecutor's office announced in 2023 that Harvey was responsible for Donna's sexual assault and murder. The announcement closed a chapter that had begun nearly 40 years earlier. But closure does not mean forgetting. It means finally knowing. Donna had not simply vanished. She had been taken. She had been killed. And the person responsible had been identified. The case also revealed something uncomfortable about investigations. Sometimes the suspect is already known. Sometimes the police have already looked at him. Sometimes the name exists in the file. What is missing is the evidence needed to connect that person to the crime. That was the situation with Harvey. His name had surfaced, but suspicion was not enough. The investigation needed proof. And that proof did not arrive until decades later. The delay was not because the family stopped caring. It was not because Donna's life became less important. It was because the tools required to answer the question had not yet reached the case. That is one of the strangest realities of modern cold case investigations. The detective may be different. The laboratory may be different. The database may be different. But the evidence can remain exactly where it was. Waiting. A biological trace does not know how many years have passed. It does not know that a detective retired. It does not know that a family lost hope. It does not know that the suspect died. It simply remains. And decades later, someone can finally test it. That was what happened with Donna. A case that seemed trapped in 1984 was reopened by 21st century science. The past suddenly became present. The evidence spoke. And this time, investigators were able to listen. For Donna's sister, that moment could not erase the years. Nothing could. It could not return Donna to 19 years old. It could not restore the future she had planned. It could not give the family back the years spent searching. It could not erase the memory of waiting for a phone call that never came. But it could answer one question. Who was responsible? And after decades, that question finally had a name. Nathaniel Harvey. The case had begun with a disappearance. It had transformed into a murder investigation. It had gone cold. And then, decades later, forensic science reopened the door. The investigation had not found a living killer. It had found something more enduring. Evidence. Evidence that had survived the passage of time. Evidence that survived the death of the suspect. Evidence that survived the years when the case seemed forgotten. Donna's story had been silent for decades. Now the silence had been broken. But the most haunting part was still the beginning. A 19-year-old woman had left behind plans, dreams, and a family that loved her. She disappeared. Her family searched. They waited. They hoped. 11 years later, her remains were found. 28 years after that, science finally identified the man responsible. Nearly 40 years had passed, and the answer had been waiting in a place investigators had already searched. Not in a confession, not in a rumor, not in a family secret, in evidence. Tiny evidence. Invisible evidence. Evidence that had survived when almost everything else had changed. And that evidence finally gave Donna Macho something her family had been denied for most of their lives. The truth. The truth had a name. But a name alone could never explain 40 years of silence. For Donna Macho's family, the announcement identifying Nathaniel Harvey did not erase the years when they had not known where she was. It did not erase the 11 years between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains. And it did not erase the decades that followed, when they knew Donna had been murdered but did not know who had done it. The investigation had to go deeper. Because before the DNA result, before the modern forensic testing, before Harvey's name was officially connected to Donna's murder, there had been a 19-year-old woman trying to build a future. Donna's life mattered long before she became a cold case headline. She worked as a legal secretary. She had ambitions in modeling. She was still young enough that the future seemed wide open. Her family knew her routines. They knew her personality. They knew the small details that never appear in police reports. And then one day, those ordinary details became evidence. A person disappears. The police ask what happened. The family asks where she went. Every answer begins with the last moment anyone knows for certain. For Donna, that final period of certainty would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. She had not simply disappeared into an unknown world. She had vanished from a place connected to her family. That meant investigators had to examine the environment around her disappearance. Who could enter? Who knew the family? Who had been in the area? Who had access? What physical evidence remained? And most importantly, was there anything that could identify the person responsible? At the time, investigators did not have the tools they would eventually use. That is easy to forget when looking backward. Modern audiences see DNA as almost automatic. A sample is collected. A laboratory tests it. A name appears. But forensic science was not that simple in the 1980s. DNA profiling was not yet the investigative tool it would later become. Investigators had to depend heavily on interviews, physical observations, fingerprints, witness accounts, and traditional police work. If a killer left behind biological material, investigators might preserve it. But preserving evidence and being able to identify its source were two very different things. That distinction would define Donna's case. The evidence could survive. The technology could not yet use it. That meant the case had to wait. And waiting came with a cost. The family began searching. They did not know whether Donna was dead. They could not visit a grave. They could not mark a final resting place. They could not answer the simplest question when someone asked about her. Where is Donna? Every year without an answer made the disappearance more painful. Then, in 1995, everything changed. The discovery of skeletal remains in Cranberry gave investigators the confirmation the family had feared. The remains were Donna. The missing woman had become a homicide victim. Now, the investigation had a physical reality. Her remains could be examined. The location could be examined. The circumstances surrounding the discovery could be reconstructed. And investigators could begin asking a different question. Who put her there? The woods where Donna was found became part of the investigation. But investigators knew that the discovery location might not have been the murder scene. That distinction opened another layer of uncertainty. If Donna had been killed somewhere else, then whoever was responsible had moved her. That required transportation. That required time. That required an opportunity. And that meant investigators had to reconstruct the movements surrounding her disappearance. Her vehicle became important. It had been found abandoned near a sewer plant. That fact created a second location. Donna's home. The abandoned vehicle. The location where her remains were found. 3 points. 3 places. And somewhere between them was the missing story. Investigators had to determine how those points connected. The distance between locations mattered. The roads mattered. The timing mattered. And the people who could move between them mattered. This is where cold case investigations become less like a single dramatic discovery and more like a reconstruction. A detective has to rebuild a world that no longer exists. The roads may look different. Buildings may have changed. People may have moved. Businesses may have closed. But the basic geography can still reveal possibilities. Who lived nearby? Who worked nearby? Who knew the area? Who could have driven through without attracting attention? Who had access to a vehicle? Those questions eventually brought investigators back toward Harvey. He had already been known to authorities. His name had appeared in connection with Donna's disappearance. But suspicion had not been enough. Then his later criminal history made the possibility more disturbing. Harvey was eventually convicted in the rape and murder of another woman. He received a life sentence. The conviction demonstrated that Harvey was capable of committing serious violence. But again, That did not automatically establish that he had killed Donna. Investigators needed this specific connection. That is where the old evidence became critical, because the question was no longer simply whether Harvey had a history of violence. It was whether he had left evidence behind in Donna's home. Modern forensic testing eventually answered that question. DNA recovered from the bedroom linked Harvey to the scene. According to New Jersey authorities, Harvey was the only person whose DNA was identified in the room who should not have been there. That was a remarkable development. For decades, the case had been built around uncertainty. Now investigators had something objective, a biological connection. The result did not simply create a new suspect. It strengthened a suspicion that had existed for years. Harvey's name had appeared before. Now science had connected him to the place where Donna had disappeared. The timing of the discovery was also significant. Harvey was already dead. He had died in prison in 2020. That meant the evidence could never be used to interrogate him. There would be no opportunity to ask what he knew. No chance to confront him with the DNA. No chance to hear an explanation. The investigation had to rely on the surviving evidence. And the surviving evidence was enough for authorities to publicly identify him as responsible. That conclusion was announced in 2023. For Donna's family, the announcement closed a question that had existed since 1984. But it also raised another. Why did it take so long? The answer was not one simple failure. Cold cases rarely have one simple explanation. Investigations can stall because evidence is limited. Witnesses disappear. Technology is unavailable. Suspects die. Records become difficult to locate. And sometimes investigators simply cannot prove what they strongly suspect. That last point matters. Police can believe someone is responsible. They can have a theory. They can even have a person of interest. But belief cannot replace evidence. Without evidence that meets the required legal standard, an arrest may not be possible. A prosecution may not be possible. A conviction may not be possible. That is why the evidence recovered from Donna's bedroom became so important. It changed the case from suspicion to scientific linkage. And suddenly, the old investigation looked different. The question was no longer simply whether Harvey had been involved. Investigators could examine how the DNA result fit with everything else they knew.
His proximity. His history.
The previous suspicion. The locations. The timeline. The evidence. Each element had to be considered together. That is how a cold case becomes a solved case. Not through one sensational clue. Through convergence. Multiple independent facts pointing toward the same conclusion. For decades, Donna's case lacked that convergence. The pieces existed, but they did not form a complete picture. The DNA result changed that. And once the connection was established, investigators could look back at the case with new clarity. The earlier suspicion of Harvey was no longer just an old note in a file. It had context. The location of Donna's abandoned vehicle was no longer just another detail. It could be considered alongside Harvey's proximity. The place where Donna's remains were found could be examined alongside his connection to the surrounding area. The evidence did not need to be invented. It only needed to be connected. That is an important distinction. Cold case investigators are not supposed to create a new story. They are supposed to discover whether the old story can finally be proven. Donna's story had been waiting for that opportunity, but the family had already endured the hardest years. Her sister Julie had been 14 when Donna disappeared. That meant Julie spent her adolescence without knowing whether her sister was alive. She grew into adulthood carrying an unanswered question. Imagine the ordinary moments. A birthday. A holiday. A family gathering. Someone remembers Donna. Someone asks about her. The answer is never simple. There is no grave to visit. No confirmed final moment.
No certainty.
Only the absence. That absence can shape an entire family. Then, 11 years later, the remains are found. The family receives confirmation of death. It is devastating. But it also creates a strange form of relief. At least now they know. Donna is not missing.
She is dead.
Her family can grieve her, but they still cannot answer the question of responsibility. Who killed her? That question becomes the new center of the family's pain. The investigation continues. The years continue. Harvey remains incarcerated. Donna's case remains unresolved. Then Harvey dies. For investigators, that could have been the end. A suspect is dead. A prosecution becomes impossible. A cold case can easily remain cold. But investigators did not stop. They continued examining the evidence. That decision mattered, because the death of a suspect does not erase the need to establish the truth. It does not make the victim's murder less important, and it does not make the family's questions disappear. In fact, the absence of a living suspect can make forensic evidence even more important. Science becomes the witness. The laboratory becomes the interrogation room. The evidence becomes the testimony. And in Donna's case, the DNA result provided something no living witness could have given: a direct biological connection. The evidence did not speak in words. It spoke through a profile, through comparison, through exclusion, through identification, and eventually through a conclusion. Nathaniel Harvey. The man investigators had considered years earlier. The man who had already been imprisoned for another murder. The man who had died before the case could be publicly resolved. The man whose DNA had remained behind. That final detail is what makes the case so haunting. A killer can disappear. A suspect can die. A witness can forget. But biological evidence can remain. The passage of time does not necessarily destroy it. Sometimes it simply waits. The investigators who first worked Donna's case could not have known what future technology would make possible. They could only work with what they had. That does not mean every decision was perfect. It means the investigation was limited by its era. The modern investigators inherited those limitations. Their task was to overcome them. That required reopening the evidence, re-examining the assumptions, and testing what could still be tested. The result was extraordinary. A case that had survived almost 40 years finally produced an official answer. Not a rumor, not a theory, not an internet claim. A law enforcement conclusion supported by DNA evidence. Donna's name could finally be separated from the word missing. She was no longer a missing 19-year-old whose fate was unknown. She was a murder victim whose killer had been identified. But there was still one unavoidable fact. Donna's life could not be restored. The future she had planned was gone. The career she hoped to build was gone. The years she should have spent with her family were gone. The family gatherings she should have attended never happened. The memories that should have accumulated were replaced by decades of questions. That is why solving a cold case is never simply about putting a name on a suspect. It is about restoring the truth to the victim. For Donna, the truth was painful, but it was finally complete enough to speak. She disappeared in 1984. Her remains were found in 1995. Modern DNA testing connected Nathaniel Harvey to evidence from the room where she disappeared. And in 2023, authorities announced that Harvey was responsible for her sexual assault and murder. The case had crossed decades. It had survived investigators, technology, silence, and the death of the man responsible. But it had not disappeared, because Donna had not disappeared from the memories of the people who loved her. And as long as someone kept asking what happened, the case still had a chance to speak. Sometimes the truth is not discovered because someone suddenly remembers. Sometimes it is not discovered because a killer finally confesses. Sometimes it is waiting in a piece of evidence that investigators collected long before anyone knew how valuable it would become. That was Donna Macho's story. The evidence waited. The family waited. And eventually, science caught up. The evidence had survived. That fact would become one of the most important details in the entire investigation. For nearly 4 decades, Donna Macho's murder had existed in the space between suspicion and proof. Investigators had theories. They had people of interest. They had physical evidence. They had a body. They had a family desperate for answers. What they did not have was the one thing that could bring all of those pieces together: A definitive connection. Then modern forensic science changed the balance. But to understand why the breakthrough mattered, it was necessary to go back to the beginning, to the moment when Donna's family still believed they might see her again. Donna was 19 years old when she disappeared in February 1984. She was living with her family in East Windsor.
She had a job.
She had plans. She was interested in modeling. She was young enough that the next stage of her life was still being written. Then suddenly there was no next stage. There was only silence. The disappearance immediately created questions that had no easy answers. If Donna had left voluntarily, where had she gone? If she had been taken, who had taken her? If she had been harmed, where was the evidence? And if someone had killed her, why had that person not been identified? Those questions would remain unanswered for 11 years. For her family, the uncertainty was devastating. Her sister Julie Berger was only 14 when Donna disappeared. That meant the disappearance was not something she experienced as a distant historical event. It happened during her childhood. Then it followed her into adulthood. Years passed.
People changed.
The family grew older. But Donna's absence remained. There were no photographs of a final resting place. No confirmed account of her last hours. No person who could stand in court and explain what happened. There was only a missing woman, and the possibility that she might still be somewhere. That possibility was enough to keep the family searching. They used private investigators. They followed leads. They pursued suggestions that might have seemed impossible to someone outside the family. Even psychics were consulted. That detail says something about the desperation created by an unresolved disappearance. When the official investigation cannot provide an answer, families sometimes turn to anything that offers a possibility. Not because they necessarily believe every claim, because doing nothing is unbearable. Every rumor can become a potential lead. Every supposed sighting can create hope. Every telephone call can produce a moment of panic. Maybe this is Donna. Maybe someone has finally seen her. Maybe she is alive. And then another lead disappears. Another hope collapses. The process repeats. That cycle can continue for years. Then came 1995. The case changed in a way the family had feared but could no longer avoid. A Boy Scout troop leader discovered skeletal human remains in a wooded area of Cranbury, New Jersey. The discovery immediately triggered an investigation. Authorities had found human remains, but the identity was not immediately known. Investigators had to determine who the person was. The remains were examined. Dental records eventually identified them as Donna Macho. 11 years after she vanished, Donna had finally been found. But finding her did not answer the question her family had been asking since 1984. It changed the question. Where is Donna?
Became.
Who killed Donna? The investigation was now a homicide investigation. That meant investigators had a crime scene. They had remains. They had the circumstances of a disappearance. They had the location where the body was found. They had Donna's abandoned vehicle. And they had a long list of unanswered questions. The location where Donna's remains were discovered was not simply a point on a map. It became part of a larger reconstruction. Investigators needed to understand how she could have reached that location. Had she been killed there? Had she been transported there? Who could have moved her? Who knew the area? Who had access to transportation? What had happened between the time Donna disappeared and the time her remains were left in the woods? These questions could not be answered by looking only at the remains. The investigation had to move outward. The abandoned vehicle became important. Donna's vehicle had been found near a sewer plant. That gave investigators another location to examine. The vehicle represented a point in time. Donna had been somewhere. Then the vehicle was left behind. Later, her remains were found elsewhere. Between those points existed a period that investigators had to reconstruct. Cold case detectives often face exactly this problem. They have the beginning. They have the end. But the middle is missing. And the middle is where the crime happened. The investigation had to determine whether someone could be placed between those locations. That was where old suspects became important. Nathaniel Harvey had already been identified as a person of interest during the investigation into Donna's disappearance. His name was not a discovery made in 2023. It had existed in the case much earlier. But investigators did not have enough evidence to charge him with Donna's murder. That distinction is essential. A person of interest is not a convicted killer. A suspicious history is not proof of a specific crime. And a theory is not a verdict. Harvey's later criminal history, however, made him impossible to ignore when the case was reopened. He had been convicted in connection with the rape and murder of another woman in Plainsboro. He received a life sentence. That conviction established that Harvey had committed a serious violent crime. But it did not automatically establish responsibility for Donna's murder. Investigators still needed a direct connection. They needed evidence that could withstand scrutiny. That was where the old evidence became so important. When Donna disappeared in 1984, investigators collected evidence from the scene. At the time, technology limited what could be learned from biological material. The evidence could be preserved. But preservation did not mean identification. Years later, forensic science had advanced. DNA profiling had become a major tool in homicide investigations. Cases that had once appeared impossible to solve could sometimes be reopened. Old biological evidence could be retested. A sample that had once produced nothing useful could potentially identify a person decades later. That possibility changed the way investigators looked at cold cases. Instead of asking only what the original investigators had learned, modern detectives could ask a different question. What can this evidence tell us now? That question eventually returned investigators to Donna's case. The old evidence was examined again. Modern testing was applied. And the results created the breakthrough that the investigation had been missing for decades. DNA recovered from the bedroom connected Nathaniel Harvey to the location. According to the New Jersey Attorney General's office, Harvey was the only person whose DNA was found in the room who should not have been there. That finding was extraordinary because Harvey's name had already appeared in the investigation. The new forensic result did not simply introduce a random suspect. It connected modern science with an old investigative theory. A person once considered a possible suspect was now linked to evidence from Donna's home. The past and the present had collided. But investigators still had to evaluate the result in context. Why was Harvey's DNA there? What did the evidence show? How did it fit the timeline? How did it fit the other known facts? That is the discipline required in a homicide investigation. Even powerful evidence must be examined carefully. The goal is not simply to find something that confirms a theory. The goal is to determine whether the evidence supports the truth. And in Donna's case, the surrounding circumstances provided additional context. Her vehicle had been abandoned near a sewer plant. That location was within walking distance of Harvey's residence. Investigators also determined that Harvey had briefly worked at a farm near the area where Donna's remains were discovered. Again, these details were not presented as independent proof of murder. They were pieces of the larger investigative picture. The DNA was the crucial scientific connection. The locations added context. The prior investigative history added context. Harvey's known criminal history added context. Together, the evidence allowed investigators to reach a conclusion that had not been possible decades earlier. But by the time that conclusion became possible, Harvey was already dead. He died in November 2020 while incarcerated at Southwood State Prison. That meant the investigation could never produce the kind of ending people often expect from a murder case. There would be no dramatic arrest, no police interrogation, no confession, no trial, no jury hearing the evidence, no sentencing hearing specifically for Donna's murder. The suspect was gone. But the case did not have to remain unanswered. Investigators could still establish responsibility through surviving evidence. That distinction is important. A case can be solved even when the suspect cannot be prosecuted. The purpose of the investigation is to establish what happened. Prosecution is a separate legal process. In Donna's case, the investigation eventually reached its conclusion after the forensic evidence was reviewed and the surrounding facts were considered. In 2023, The New Jersey Attorney General's Office and Mercer County Prosecutor's Office announced that Nathaniel Harvey was responsible for Donna's sexual assault and murder. For her family, the announcement represented something they had waited nearly 40 years to hear. A name. A conclusion. An answer. But it also forced them to confront another painful reality. The man responsible had been alive for decades while Donna's family waited. He had been incarcerated. He had eventually died. And the truth about Donna's murder was only formally announced after his death. That meant there could be no confrontation. No opportunity for Donna's family to look at him and ask why. No opportunity to hear his version of events. No opportunity to watch him face a jury. The evidence had to speak without him. And that evidence had been waiting. That is what makes the case so haunting. The answer was not created in 2023. The evidence existed long before then. The difference was that investigators finally had the scientific ability to interpret it. A cold case can therefore be misleading. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. The file sits. The years pass. The headlines disappear. People move on. But evidence can remain. And when technology changes, the meaning of that evidence can change with it. Donna's case demonstrates that perfectly. A 19-year-old woman disappeared. Her family spent 11 years wondering whether she was alive. Her remains were discovered in 1995. Investigators knew she had been murdered. A suspect had already appeared in the history of the investigation. But the connection could not be established strongly enough. Then, decades later, modern DNA testing changed the equation. The evidence pointed to Harvey. And suddenly, a case that had been silent for years had something it had never possessed before. A scientifically supported answer. The announcement did not restore Donna's life. It did not give her back the future she had been denied. It did not give her family back the years they had spent searching. But it did something else. It returned her identity to the center of the story. Donna was not simply an old case. She was a 19-year-old woman who had plans. She had a family. She had people waiting for her. She had a future that was taken away. For years, the word associated with her name was missing. Then it became murdered. And finally, decades later, investigators were able to attach a name to the person responsible. That progression tells the entire story. Missing.
Found.
Unsolved. Reopened. Identified. The investigation had moved through generations. The original detectives had worked without modern DNA technology. Later investigators inherited the evidence. New technology gave them another opportunity. And eventually, the case moved from uncertainty toward resolution. But the emotional impact remained. Because solving a murder does not undo the murder. It only tells the truth about it. For Donna's family, that truth came painfully late. But late is not the same as never. For nearly 40 years, Donna's story remained incomplete. Then the evidence finally connected the past to the present. The case that once seemed destined to remain a mystery had finally spoken. And the voice came from something almost invisible. DNA. A trace left behind decades earlier. A biological signature that had no idea how much time would pass. It simply remained, waiting. And when investigators finally knew how to read it, it pointed toward the man whose name had already been buried inside the old investigation. Nathaniel Harvey. The suspect was dead. The victim had been dead for decades. But the evidence was still alive. And that was enough to finally tell Donna's family what they had been waiting to hear. The truth had survived. The truth had survived, but the truth was not simple. For Donna Macho's family, there was no single moment when decades of pain suddenly disappeared. There was no sentence that could return the years that had been taken from them. There was only a conclusion, delivered after an investigation that had crossed nearly 4 decades. Nathaniel Harvey was responsible. That was the conclusion announced by New Jersey authorities in 2023. But before investigators could reach that conclusion, they had to reconstruct a case that had been damaged by time. The original investigation had begun when Donna was still alive. That detail mattered. At the beginning, police were not investigating a murder. They were trying to find a missing 19-year-old woman. That meant the first hours were filled with uncertainty. There was no body. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no forensic profile pointing toward a killer. There was simply a young woman who had disappeared. For the people closest to Donna, the difference was enormous. Police could not tell the family that she was dead. They could not tell them that she had been abducted. They could not tell them where she was. Every possibility remained open. And that meant hope remained open too. For 11 years, that hope had nowhere to go. The family searched. They investigated. They followed information from people who believed they might know something. They used private investigators. They consulted trackers. They even consulted psychics. None of it brought Donna home. Then the discovery in Cranberry ended the uncertainty. The skeletal remains were found in a wooded area. The discovery was made by a Boy Scout troop leader. Dental records eventually established the identity.
Donna Macho.
The missing 19-year-old had finally been found, but she had not been found alive. The discovery changed the emotional landscape of the case immediately. The family could finally stop asking whether Donna might still return. But they now had to face a more brutal question. Who had killed her? That question became the central purpose of the investigation. And one of the first challenges was reconstructing Donna's final known movements. Her vehicle had been found abandoned near a sewer plant. That location mattered because it suggested that the disappearance was not simply a person leaving town and abandoning her old life.
Her car remained.
Donna did not. Investigators had to consider what could have happened between the time she was last known to be alive and the moment her vehicle was discovered. Who had been with her? Who could have driven her car? Who could have had access to her? Who could have moved her? Every possibility had to be examined. The investigation eventually turned toward Nathaniel Harvey. Harvey was not an unknown figure. He had already come to investigators' attention. His name had been considered in connection with Donna's disappearance. But the investigation did not produce enough evidence to charge him with her murder. That fact would become extremely important decades later. Because when a case is eventually solved, people naturally ask why it took so long. Why was the suspect not arrested earlier? Why did investigators not have enough evidence? Why did the case remain open for decades? In Donna's case, one answer was simple. Suspicion was not proof. Investigators could suspect Harvey. They could examine his history. They could question his possible connection to Donna. But they needed evidence tying him directly to the crime. Without that connection, a suspicion remained a suspicion. And the investigation could not legally leap from suspicion to guilt. Harvey's criminal history made the situation more disturbing. He was later convicted in the rape and murder of another woman in Plainsboro. He received a life sentence. That conviction demonstrated that Harvey had committed a serious violent crime. But investigators still could not use another conviction as automatic proof that he had murdered Donna. Each homicide had to be established independently. Each victim deserved her own investigation. Each piece of evidence had to be tied to the specific crime. That is one of the hardest realities of criminal investigation. A person can be a murderer and still not be responsible for every murder investigator suspect. The evidence has to distinguish one crime from another. That standard protects the innocent. It also makes cold cases difficult. Investigators may have a strong theory but lack the evidence required to prove it. Then time begins working against them. Witnesses age. Memories fade. People move. Records disappear. And eventually suspects can die. Harvey remained incarcerated for years. Then, in November 2020, he died at Southwood State Prison. At that moment, the possibility of a traditional prosecution for Donna's murder disappeared. There could be no arrest, no trial, no plea, no jury. If the case was ever going to be resolved, it would have to happen through the evidence. That was where the modern investigation became crucial. Cold case detectives did not have to accept the limits faced by investigators in 1984. They could return to the evidence. They could ask questions using modern forensic technology. They could reconsider biological material that earlier investigators had been unable to interpret. The science had changed. DNA profiling had become one of the most powerful tools in modern criminal investigations, and Donna's case contained evidence that could potentially be tested. The bedroom became particularly important. According to New Jersey authorities, DNA recovered from the room belonged to Harvey. More importantly, authorities said Harvey was the only person whose DNA was found there who should not have been there. That result was not merely another investigative rumor. It was a scientific connection between Harvey and the place where Donna had disappeared. The significance was enormous. For years, Harvey had been a name. Now he was connected to physical evidence. The old theory had finally acquired something it had been missing: scientific support. Investigators could now look backward. They could examine Harvey's known movements. They could examine his connection to the area. They could examine the abandoned vehicle. They could examine the location where Donna's remains had been found. And they could ask whether all of those facts were consistent with the same explanation. The investigation did not need to invent a new story. It needed to determine whether the surviving evidence told the same story. The geography became important. Donna's vehicle had been abandoned near a sewer plant. The location was within walking distance of Harvey's residence. That did not prove that Harvey had killed Donna, but it placed his residence within the physical environment surrounding a critical part of the case. Investigators also determined that Harvey had briefly worked at a farm near the area where Donna's remains were eventually discovered. Again, that fact alone could not establish guilt. But it became another piece of the reconstruction. A cold case can be understood as a collection of separate facts. The investigator's job is to determine whether those facts remain separate or whether they connect. A vehicle, a house, a wooded area, a suspect, a DNA profile, a history, a timeline. The challenge is making sure the connections are real, not imagined, not forced, not created simply because investigators want the case solved. That discipline was especially important because Harvey could not defend himself. He was already dead. Any conclusion reached after his death had to be supported by evidence strong enough to stand without an interrogation or trial. The case could not depend on a confession. There was none. It could not depend on a courtroom verdict. There was none. It had to depend on the investigation. That made the 2023 announcement different from the ending of a conventional murder case. There was no dramatic courtroom moment. There was no jury. Instead, law enforcement publicly explained the evidence and identified Harvey as the person responsible. For Donna's family, that announcement finally transformed a question into an answer. But the emotional reaction to such an announcement can be complicated. Closure is often described as though it were a door that suddenly closes. Real life is not that clean. Knowing who killed someone does not mean the grief disappears. Knowing where a loved one died does not make the death easier. And knowing the identity of a killer cannot restore the person who was taken. For Donna's sister, the journey had lasted most of her life. She was 14 when Donna disappeared. By the time authorities identified Harvey as responsible, decades had passed. The little sister, who had once waited for Donna to come home, had grown into an adult. The investigation had become part of her history. The unanswered question had followed her through years of ordinary life. Then, suddenly, there was a name: Nathaniel Harvey. It is difficult to imagine the emotional weight of hearing that name after so many years. It was not a stranger appearing from nowhere. It was a man whose name had already existed in the investigation. That makes the case even more unsettling. The answer had not necessarily been completely invisible. It had been suspected. But suspicion had not been enough. The evidence needed to catch up. And evidence eventually did. The DNA result gave investigators something the original investigation could not provide: a connection that could be examined scientifically. That is the real significance of the breakthrough. Not that modern science magically solved a mystery. The investigation still required years of work. The evidence still had to be located. It had to be tested. The results had to be interpreted. The surrounding facts had to be evaluated. But the technology created an opportunity that did not exist in 1984. That opportunity changed everything. It also demonstrates why old evidence should not automatically be considered worthless. A piece of evidence can appear insignificant for decades. Then a new method can give it meaning. The evidence itself has not changed. The ability to read it has changed. Donna's case is an example of that principle. Her family waited. The evidence waited. Science advanced. Eventually, the old evidence could provide an answer. There is another reason the case remained important. Donna's identity could never be reduced to the circumstances of her death. She was 19. She had ambitions.
She had a job.
She had a family. She had plans. Those facts mattered because murder investigations can sometimes transform victims into little more than names in a file. Cold case work has the responsibility to reverse that. The victim has to remain at the center. The question is not only who committed the crime. It is who was lost. Donna was lost. Her family lost a daughter and sister. The community lost a young woman who should have had decades ahead of her. The investigation could not give those years back, but it could establish what happened. And establishing what happened matters. It matters because uncertainty allows a crime to remain suspended in time. It leaves families wondering whether something was missed, whether someone knew, whether someone lied, whether the killer was still alive, whether the killer was watching. For Donna's family, that uncertainty lasted decades. The 2023 announcement finally removed one of the greatest unknowns. The killer had been identified, but another reality remained. Harvey had died 3 years earlier. There would be no punishment for Donna's murder beyond the life sentence he had already been serving for another crime. There would be no courtroom testimony. No opportunity for a prosecutor to present the entire story before a jury. No sentence specifically tied to Donna. The justice system could not recreate the ending that might have happened if the case had been solved while Harvey was alive. That is the bitter side of a cold case resolution. Sometimes the truth arrives too late for the justice people imagined. But truth still matters. It matters to the family. It matters to investigators. It matters to the historical record. And it matters to the victim. Donna's name had spent years connected to uncertainty. Now it was connected to an answer. The case had begun with a disappearance. It had become a homicide. It had gone cold. And then modern science reopened it. The evidence led investigators back to a man whose name had appeared decades earlier. Nathaniel Harvey. The same name. A different era. A different investigation. A different level of technology. And finally, a conclusion. The most haunting detail is that the evidence had been there long before the answer. The biological trace did not arrive in 2023. The technology did. The evidence had simply been waiting for investigators to ask the right question. Could this old material tell us something now that it could not tell us then? The answer was yes. And that answer changed Donna's story forever. For nearly 40 years, her family had carried an unanswered question. Now they carried something else. The knowledge of who was responsible. It was painful. It was incomplete. It came far too late. But it was real. And sometimes in a cold case, real is the closest thing to closure a family can receive. Donna had disappeared as a 19-year-old woman. She should have grown older. She should have built a career. She should have made mistakes, fallen in love, changed her mind, celebrated birthdays, and watched the people around her grow old. Instead, her life ended before any of those ordinary futures could happen. The investigation could not restore that future, but it could restore the truth. And the truth was finally clear enough to say out loud. Donna Macho was murdered. Nathaniel Harvey was responsible. And the evidence that finally established that connection had survived longer than almost everyone involved. The detectives had changed. The technology had changed. The suspect had died. But the evidence remained.
Silent.
Invisible. Waiting. Until, decades later, someone finally knew how to make it speak. The case did not end when Donna's remains were identified. In some ways, That discovery was only the beginning of the harder investigation. For 11 years, the family had lived without knowing what had happened to her. Now they knew she had been murdered. But knowing that Donna was dead did not explain how she had been taken, who had been with her, or why the person responsible had remained beyond the reach of investigators for so long. The evidence had to be rebuilt. And one of the most important pieces was already sitting inside the old case file. Evidence from Donna's bedroom had been collected during the original investigation. Investigators had discovered biological evidence consistent with a sexual assault. But the forensic technology available at the time could not identify the person responsible. That limitation would haunt the investigation. The evidence existed. The suspect might have been nearby, but the science could not yet complete the connection. Years passed, then decades, and the evidence remained. That is what makes cold cases so different from ordinary investigations. The passage of time can destroy witnesses and memories, but physical evidence sometimes survives almost untouched. A stain does not forget. A biological sample does not change its story because 20 years have passed. The problem is that investigators have to know how to read it. In 1984, the technology was still developing. In the years that followed, DNA analysis became dramatically more powerful. And eventually, investigators could return to evidence that had once produced only questions. The old samples were tested again. This time, the results were different. The DNA from evidence in Donna's bedroom matched Nathaniel Harvey. Authorities later stated that Harvey's was the only DNA found in the room that should not have been there. That changed the investigation. For decades, Harvey had been more than a name pulled from nowhere. He had been considered a person of interest early in the case. But investigators had never possessed the forensic connection required to conclusively identify him as Donna's killer. Now they did. And suddenly, details that had remained separate for years could be examined together. Harvey had been a former East Windsor resident. Donna had disappeared from East Windsor. Her vehicle had been abandoned near a sewer plant within walking distance of Harvey's residence. Her remains were later discovered in Cranberry, near a farm where Harvey had briefly worked. None of those details, standing alone, established murder. But cold cases are not always solved by one piece of evidence. They're solved when separate pieces begin pointing in the same direction. The DNA was the crucial link. The locations provided context. The old investigative history provided context. And Harvey's known criminal history made the connection even more significant. Around the time Donna disappeared, Harvey was arrested in connection with several sexual assaults and an unrelated murder, according to authorities. But investigators still had to distinguish fact from assumption. Harvey's other crimes could not simply be used as proof that he had killed Donna. Donna deserved her own evidence, her own answer. That answer eventually came through the forensic evidence. But there was another complication. Harvey was no longer alive. He had died at Southwood State Prison in November 2020. That meant there would never be a conventional ending. No detectives could sit across a table from him. No investigator could place the DNA report in front of him and demand an explanation. No prosecutor could question him in court. No jury could hear the evidence against him. The investigation had to stand on what remained. And what remained was enough for authorities to make their conclusion public. In April 2023, New Jersey Attorney General Matthew Platkin and Mercer County Prosecutor Angelo Onofre announced that a collaborative investigation had conclusively identified Harvey as responsible for the sexual assault and murder of Donna Macho. Almost 40 years after Donna disappeared, the name of the man responsible was finally attached to her case. But the road to that announcement had been filled with uncertainty. The original investigation had not simply stopped caring. Authorities had developed persons of interest. They had followed leads. They had worked with the evidence available to them. But eventually, investigative leads dissipated. The case went cold. And for Donna's family, cold did not mean forgotten. It meant living with the same question year after year. What happened to her? Her sister Julie Berger was only 14 when Donna disappeared. She later described how the search affected the family. They hired private investigators. They hired trackers. They consulted psychics. They spent money they could hardly afford because they were still trying to find Donna. And for years, they held on to the possibility that she might somehow be alive. That possibility disappeared in 1995. A Boy Scout troop leader found skeletal remains in a wooded area of Cranberry. Dental records confirmed that the remains were Donna's. The family had finally found their daughter and sister, but they had found her in the worst possible way. And now the investigation had to answer the question that had been waiting since the day she vanished. Who did this? The answer would not come from the woods. It would not come from a confession. It would not come from a witness stepping forward decades later. It would come from evidence collected long before modern investigators had the ability to fully understand it. That is the strange rhythm of a cold case. The past does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. A forgotten laboratory sample can wait. A fingerprint can wait. A DNA profile can wait. A photograph can wait. A police report can wait. And when a new detective opens the file, the old evidence can suddenly become new again. Donna's case was reopened through the state's Cold Case Network, working with the Mercer County Homicide Task Force and New Jersey State Police. The goal was not simply to revisit history. It was to determine whether modern methods could answer questions that investigators in 1984 could not answer. The result was decisive. Harvey's DNA was found in Donna's bedroom. That single forensic connection gave investigators the peace they had lacked for decades. It also explained why the case had remained so difficult. The suspect had been on investigators' radar. But without a conclusive forensic match, the investigation could not cross the line from suspicion to identification. That line matters. A detective can suspect someone. A family can suspect someone. A community can suspect someone. But suspicion does not establish guilt. Evidence does. And in Donna's case, modern DNA technology finally provided the evidence authorities said was necessary. The irony is brutal. Harvey was alive during the years when the investigation was searching for answers. He was alive when the case went cold. He was alive when Donna's remains were discovered. He was alive while her family continued to wonder. But he died before the forensic breakthrough became public. The man responsible would never hear the official conclusion from a prosecutor. He would never see his name announced as the killer in Donna's case. He would never face Donna's family. That reality left the family with a complicated form of closure. The answer had arrived, but justice in the traditional sense had not. There would be no new sentence, no new prison term, no courtroom. Harvey was already serving a life sentence for another murder when he died. So the 2023 announcement was not about putting him behind bars. He was already there. It was about establishing the truth. And truth matters even when punishment is no longer possible. It matters because Donna's family had spent decades wondering whether the person responsible was still free. They no longer had to wonder. They knew. It matters because Donna's name could finally be removed from the category of unresolved disappearance. She had not simply vanished. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. And authorities had identified the person responsible. It matters because the case demonstrated something else. A cold case can survive technological change. Evidence that could not solve a crime in 1984 might solve it in 2023. That does not mean every old case can be solved. It does not mean every biological sample will produce a name. It means that time does not always destroy the possibility of an answer. Sometimes the evidence survives longer than the people who created the mystery. Donna's family waited almost 40 years. Investigators waited through changing technology. The case waited through the death of the suspect. And eventually the evidence spoke. The answer was Nathaniel Harvey. But even with that answer, there was still something investigators could never recover. Donna's final moments. The exact sequence of events. The thoughts she had before her life was taken. The fear she may have experienced. The future she should have had. Those things were gone forever. The legal question may be answered. The emotional question may never be. For Donna's family, solving the case could not give them back the sister they lost. It could only tell them what happened to her. That distinction is the heart of the story. The investigation did not create a happy ending. It created an ending. And after decades of uncertainty, even an ending filled with grief can be better than silence. The evidence had survived. Donna's name had survived. Her family's memory had survived. And eventually, the investigation caught up with the truth. Nearly 40 years after the disappearance, the case was no longer an unanswered question. The evidence had finally become a voice. And that voice pointed to the man whose name had been waiting inside the investigation for decades. The name was no longer just a name in an old file. Nathaniel Harvey was now connected to Donna Macho through evidence that had survived for decades. But even after investigators reached that conclusion, the story did not become simple. Because the most painful part of a cold case is rarely the moment when the suspect is identified. It is everything that happened before. The years when nobody knew. The years when a family waited. The years when a 19-year-old woman's disappearance remained an unanswered question. Donna's family had spent years trying to understand what had happened to her. They could not know that the answer was connected to a man who would eventually be imprisoned for another murder. They could not know that evidence from Donna's bedroom would one day identify him. They could not know that modern DNA technology would reopen a case that had seemed almost impossible to solve. All they knew was that Donna was gone. And when someone disappears, every possibility becomes frightening. Maybe she had left voluntarily. Maybe she had been taken. Maybe she had been injured. Maybe she was alive somewhere and unable to contact her family. Or maybe something far worse had happened. The family could not choose which possibility was true. They had to live with all of them. That uncertainty lasted 11 years. Then came the discovery in Cranberry. The skeletal remains were found in a wooded area by a Boy Scout troop leader. The discovery immediately changed the case. The family had been searching for a missing woman. Now investigators were looking at a homicide. The remains were eventually identified through dental records.
Donna.
The name that had been missing from the family for more than a decade was suddenly attached to a body. It was confirmation. It was devastating. And it created a new mission. Find the killer. The location where Donna was found became part of the investigation. But investigators could not assume that it was the place where she had been murdered. A body can be moved. A victim can be transported. A person responsible can choose a location far away from the original crime. So detectives had to reconstruct the events. Donna's vehicle was found abandoned near a sewer plant. That gave investigators another important location. Her home. Her vehicle. The wooded area where her remains were discovered. The investigation had to determine how those locations were connected. And once again, the name Nathaniel Harvey appeared. Harvey had been considered a person of interest during the original investigation. That fact was significant. The eventual solution did not come from a completely unknown stranger. It came from an old investigative path that had never produced enough evidence. At the time, investigators had reasons to look at Harvey, but they lacked what they needed to move forward. There was no DNA match. There was no modern forensic confirmation. There was no conclusive evidence establishing that he had been in Donna's bedroom during the crime. Years later, that would change. The difference was technology. Modern DNA testing could examine biological evidence that investigators in the 1980s could not use in the same way. The old evidence was not necessarily useless. It was simply waiting for a more powerful method. When investigators returned to the evidence, they found a connection. Harvey's DNA was recovered from Donna's bedroom. Authorities said it was the only DNA found there belonging to someone who should not have been present. That statement was crucial. The investigation now had a scientific link between the suspect and the location of Donna's disappearance. It was not a theory. It was not a rumor. It was not a witness who might have remembered incorrectly after 30 years. It was forensic evidence. And forensic evidence has a different kind of power. It does not depend on memory. It does not become confused because a witness is older. It does not change because people have forgotten details. DNA can remain stable as evidence for decades. That is why the old sample mattered. The technology had changed. The evidence had not. And once the match was established, investigators could return to the rest of the case with a new perspective. Harvey had been a former East Windsor resident. Donna had disappeared from East Windsor. Her vehicle had been abandoned near a sewer plant close to his residence. And Harvey had briefly worked at a farm near the area where Donna's remains were discovered. Each fact had to be examined carefully. Investigators could not simply stack suspicious details together and call that proof. They had to determine whether the facts were consistent with the forensic evidence. That is what made the DNA result so important. It gave the rest of the evidence a center. Without the DNA connection, the other details might remain circumstantial. With the DNA connection, investigators had a direct forensic link to examine. And then there was Harvey's criminal history. He had been convicted in the rape and murder of another woman. He received a life sentence. That history did not prove that he killed Donna, but it made the forensic connection more significant. Investigators were no longer examining a random person whose DNA happened to appear somewhere. They were examining a person already connected to violent crimes against women. The case began to form a coherent picture. But there was still a problem. Harvey was dead. He died in prison in November 2020. That meant the final investigation had to proceed without him. There would be no confession. There would be no explanation. There would be no chance to ask him whether he had been in Donna's room. There would be no opportunity to confront him with the evidence. The detectives had to work without the person they believed was responsible. In many investigations, a suspect's reaction can become another piece of evidence. A denial, a contradiction, an alibi, a confession. None of that was available here. The physical evidence had to carry the story. That made the forensic work even more important. Investigators had to make sure the evidence was reliable. They had to establish the connection. They had to examine the circumstances. They had to determine whether the evidence supported the conclusion. And after years of work, authorities announced the result. Harvey was responsible for Donna's sexual assault and murder. The announcement came in 2023, nearly 40 years after Donna disappeared. The case was finally considered solved. But for the family, the word solved could never mean what it means in a detective's report. A detective sees a solved case as a completed investigation. A family sees a solved case as the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of another. Because the truth can hurt. Donna's family had once been able to imagine that she might still be alive. That hope had disappeared in 1995. Then they had to imagine a different future. A future where the killer was still unknown. A future where someone responsible might never be identified. That uncertainty lasted for decades. Then the answer came. But the man was already dead. That meant the family received the truth without the justice they might have imagined. No trial. No sentence. No courtroom. No public testimony. The suspect could not be questioned. The investigation could only establish responsibility. And sometimes that is the final boundary of a cold case. The truth can be recovered. The past can be reconstructed. The killer can be identified. But the lost years cannot be returned. Donna was still 19 when her life ended. That number is one of the most haunting facts in the entire case. 19. A teenager standing at the edge of adulthood. A young woman with a job. A young woman interested in modeling. A daughter. A sister. A person whose future was still unwritten. The investigation eventually became filled with technical terms. DNA. Evidence. Locations. Records. Cold case files. But behind every technical term was Donna. And behind Donna was a family. That is why the emotional dimension of the case cannot be separated from the forensic one. The DNA did not solve an abstract puzzle. It answered a question that had been destroying a family for decades. Who did this to Donna? The answer was Nathaniel Harvey. And once that answer existed, the family could finally stop looking for a different explanation. They could stop wondering whether Donna had simply disappeared. They could stop wondering whether the person responsible was still unknown. They could stop asking whether the investigation had missed the killer completely. The answer was there. It had been buried beneath years of uncertainty. But there was another uncomfortable question. How could so much time pass before the case was resolved? The answer lies partly in the limits of the era. In 1984, investigators did not have today's DNA capabilities. Biological evidence could be collected without providing an immediate identity. A sample could be stored without revealing the person who left it. That means the original investigators could have been holding a piece of the answer without knowing its value. Modern cold case work changes that equation. Detectives can reopen evidence. Laboratories can perform more advanced testing. Databases can provide comparisons. Old suspects can be reconsidered. Old evidence can become new evidence. Donna's case demonstrates that process in one of the most painful ways possible. The original investigators were searching for a missing 19-year-old. The later investigators were examining a homicide. The final investigators were examining DNA. Different questions. Same evidence. And eventually, the questions converged. The investigation also shows why preserving evidence matters. If the biological material from Donna's bedroom had not survived, the later DNA connection might never have happened. The case could have remained unresolved. Harvey could have remained only a person of interest. The family might never have received an official answer. But the evidence remained. Decades passed. Harvey died. Donna's family aged. Yet the biological evidence still carried the same information. That is one of the strangest truths about forensic science. A person can disappear from the world, but a trace of that person can remain. And sometimes, that trace becomes the key to a murder investigation decades later. Donna's story was no longer only about a disappearance in 1984. It was also about the survival of evidence, the survival of memory, the survival of a family's determination, and the ability of investigators to return to a case that had once seemed impossible. The final announcement did not erase the tragedy. It simply placed the final missing piece into the record. Donna Macho had been murdered. Nathaniel Harvey was responsible, and the evidence had finally connected them. There was no dramatic confession, no secret diary, no hidden message, no killer returning to the scene. There was something quieter, something far more powerful. Science. A biological trace. A result produced decades after the crime. A result that gave investigators the connection they had lacked. And in the end, that was enough to break the silence. For years, Donna's family had been asking the same question. Where is she? Then they learned she was dead. For even longer they asked another. Who killed her? Decades later, they finally received the answer. The man responsible had already died. But his DNA had not disappeared. It remained in the evidence. And when investigators finally tested it with modern methods, the past came rushing back. The 19-year-old woman. The abandoned vehicle. The wooded area. The old case file. The suspect's name. The evidence. The years of waiting. All of it converged. And for the first time since Donna disappeared, the investigation had something it could not have before.
Certainty.
Not the certainty that could restore her life. Not the certainty that could erase the family's pain. But the certainty that could finally end the question. Donna Macho had not been forgotten. Her case had not vanished. And the evidence had not stopped speaking. It had simply been waiting for someone to hear it. The investigation had reached a point that earlier detectives could never have imagined. The old evidence was back in the laboratory. The cold case had been reopened. And for the first time in decades, investigators were able to examine Donna Macho's disappearance with tools that simply did not exist when she vanished. In February 2022, the case was formally presented to New Jersey's Central Regional Cold Case Task Force, part of the state's cold case network. Investigators began a comprehensive reinvestigation. Viable physical evidence was resubmitted to the New Jersey State Police Central Regional Laboratory. That evidence included DNA material and fingerprints. The file was no longer sleeping. Detectives were looking again. Every old lead could be questioned. Every surviving piece of evidence could be reconsidered. Every assumption could be tested. And somewhere inside that evidence was the connection investigators had been missing for almost 40 years. Donna had disappeared from her East Windsor home on or about February 26, 1984. She was 19. Her parents and sisters were there. Then she was gone. The investigation that followed produced persons of interest. Nathaniel Harvey became one of them. But the original investigation could not establish that he was responsible. The leads eventually dissipated. The case went cold. Years passed. Donna's family waited. Then, in April 1995, her remains were found in a wooded area in Cranberry. Dental records confirmed the identity. Donna was finally found. But the investigation now faced an even darker problem. The person responsible had disappeared into the shadows of the case. Investigators knew Donna had been murdered, but they needed to know how. They needed to know who. And they needed evidence strong enough to establish the answer. The original autopsy reported a gunshot wound to Donna's head. But when the case was reopened decades later, medical examiners examined the remains again. The new examination changed an important detail. The investigators could determine that a head injury had caused Donna's death, but they could not conclusively establish that the injury had been caused by a gunshot. Her cause of death was amended to evidence of homicidal violence. The manner of death remained homicide. That finding was significant. It demonstrated why old cases have to be revisited carefully. Time can change more than the technology. It can change the questions investigators are able to ask. A new examination can challenge an old assumption. A new laboratory method can reveal something hidden. A new detective can notice something that an earlier investigation could not. That was happening now. The evidence was being reconsidered piece by piece. And then investigators returned to one of the most important pieces of all, the biological evidence from Donna's bedroom. During the original investigation, police had found Harvey's semen in the room. But the DNA testing available at the time could not identify one specific individual as the source. The evidence was there. The identity was not. That distinction had kept the case from being solved. Now, the technology had changed. The same evidence could be tested again. This time, the result was different. Modern DNA testing matched the biological evidence to Nathaniel Harvey. Authorities determined that Harvey's DNA was the only DNA evidence in the room that should not have been present. The case had finally acquired its strongest connection. Harvey's name was no longer simply associated with an old investigative theory. His DNA was connected to evidence from the bedroom. That was the breakthrough. But investigators did not stop with the DNA. They looked at the geography. They looked at the history. They looked at the old investigative leads. They looked at everything that survived. Donna's vehicle had been abandoned near a sewer plant. The location was within walking distance of Harvey's residence. Her remains had been found near a farm where Harvey had briefly worked around the time she disappeared. The locations created a disturbing pattern. Donna disappeared from East Windsor. Her vehicle was abandoned near the sewer plant. Her remains were later discovered in Cranberry. Harvey had a connection to the area. And now his DNA was connected to Donna's bedroom. Investigators had to ask whether those facts were connected. The answer became clearer as the reinvestigation continued. But there was another part of Harvey's history that detectives could not ignore. Around the time Donna disappeared, Harvey had been arrested in connection with several sexual assaults and an unrelated murder in the Windsor and Plainsboro area. He was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment for a different homicide. He remained incarcerated from his arrest in 1985 until his death in 2020. That history did not automatically prove that Harvey killed Donna. It was not enough by itself. The investigators still needed Donna-specific evidence. And they now had it. The DNA. That distinction mattered. Because a cold case investigation cannot simply say, this person was dangerous, therefore he must have committed this crime. The evidence has to connect the suspect to the victim, to the location, to the circumstances. In Donna's case, the DNA provided exactly that kind of connection. It placed Harvey's biological material inside the bedroom where investigators believed Donna had been sexually assaulted. And the state later said that all other potential suspects had been eliminated. Mercer County prosecutor Angelo Onofre stated that investigators had tested all viable evidence and exhausted the leads, leaving them confident that Harvey was the perpetrator. The investigation was closing in, but the person they were identifying was no longer alive. Nathaniel Harvey had died in November 2020 at Southwood State Prison in Bridgeton. That created a strange ending to an extraordinarily long investigation. The detectives had finally reached the answer, but the suspect was gone. There would be no interrogation.
No courtroom confession.
No dramatic arrest. No opportunity for prosecutors to present the case against Harvey to a jury. The only thing left to speak for him was the evidence. And the evidence was speaking clearly. That is what makes the case so haunting. Harvey had been identified as a possible suspect decades earlier. The investigation had looked at him, but the leads went cold. Then the case disappeared into the enormous collection of unresolved crimes that law enforcement agencies carry through the years. Donna's family continued living with the consequences. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a 19-year-old woman whose life should have continued, and they had no answer for decades. When the remains were found in 1995, they gained one terrible certainty. Donna was dead. But they still did not know who had killed her. That uncertainty could be almost as cruel as the disappearance itself. Because once a body is found, the family can begin to grieve. But if the killer remains unidentified, another fear takes its place. What if the person responsible is still alive? What if he is still living somewhere? What if he is watching the family? What if the case is never solved? Donna's family carried them for years. Then the Cold Case Network reopened the investigation. It was not simply another review. The state brought together multiple agencies. The Central Regional Cold Case Task Force worked with the New Jersey State Police and Mercer County authorities. Forensic scientists were brought back into the process. Physical evidence was resubmitted. The case was approached with modern technology and a fresh investigative perspective. This was the moment when the past collided with the present. The detectives working the case decades earlier could not use today's technology. The investigators reopening it could. That difference mattered. A biological sample that had once been inconclusive could now be compared with much greater precision. And when that comparison was made, the result pointed back to Harvey, the same man whose name had existed in the investigation decades earlier. The same man who had later been imprisoned for another homicide. The same man who died before investigators could publicly close Donna's case. The evidence had survived him. It had survived the original detectives. It had survived the passing years. And it had survived the disappearance of Donna herself. That is the strange power of forensic evidence. It does not need a memory. It does not need a witness to remember exactly what happened. It does not need a suspect to confess. It can remain silent for decades and still retain the information investigators need. The evidence in Donna's case had done exactly that. The biological material found in her bedroom had been collected during the original investigation. At the time, it could not identify Harvey. Decades later, it could. That single difference transformed the case. But there was another emotional layer. Donna's family had spent years trying to find her. They had hired private investigators. They had used trackers. They had pursued leads. They had even consulted psychics. They did whatever they could because they did not know whether Donna was alive. That search lasted until the discovery of her remains in 1995. And even after that discovery, the family did not have the complete story. They knew she had been murdered. They did not know who had done it. That missing piece remained for almost another 3 decades. Then, in 2023, the state finally announced the conclusion. Attorney General Matthew Platkin and Mercer County Prosecutor Angelo Onofre announced that the collaborative investigation had conclusively identified Nathaniel Harvey as the person responsible for Donna's sexual assault and murder. Nearly 40 years had passed. The case was finally closed. But closed did not mean that everything was healed. It meant that investigators had exhausted the viable evidence and leads. It meant that the identity of the perpetrator had been established. It meant that Donna's family finally had an official answer. But the years remained. The birthdays that Donna never reached. The The family moments she never experienced. The life she never got to live. No investigation can recover those. No laboratory can restore them. No DNA match can reverse time. The purpose of solving a cold case is not to pretend that the damage can be undone. It is to refuse to let the victim disappear a second time. Donna had already been taken from her family. Her story could not also be allowed to vanish into an unsolved case file. That is why the 2023 announcement mattered. The investigation had finally placed Donna's name beside an answer. Not a theory. Not a rumor. Not an anonymous suspect. A conclusion supported by the surviving evidence. Nathaniel Harvey. And perhaps the most disturbing part was that the case had never truly been silent. The evidence had been there. The name had been there. The records had been there. The locations had been there. What was missing was the ability to connect them. Modern science supplied that connection. And once it did, decades of uncertainty began collapsing. The case no longer asked whether Donna's killer could ever be identified. It had an answer. The killer was dead, but the truth was alive. And that truth had finally reached the people who had spent the longest waiting for it. Donna's family. After nearly 40 years, the question that had haunted them had finally been answered. Who killed Donna Macho? The evidence pointed to Nathaniel Harvey. And this time, the case file could finally close. The case was solved, but the silence surrounding Donna Macho's death did not disappear with the announcement. For the people who had known her, there was still the same empty space. The same missing chair. The same memories. The same question that had once filled every conversation. What happened to Donna? For almost 40 years, that question had existed in different forms. At first, it was a disappearance. Then it became a search. Then a recovery. Then a homicide investigation. Then a cold case. And finally, decades later, it became a solved murder. But behind every change in the case was the same 19-year-old woman. Donna. She had not changed. The world around her had. Technology changed. Investigators changed. The legal system moved forward. People who had once been young grew old. Some witnesses disappeared. Some investigators retired. And the man authorities eventually identified as her killer died behind prison walls. Yet Donna remained at the center of the investigation. That was what the cold case detectives had to remember when they opened the file again. They were not simply reopening an old mystery. They were reopening the last known chapter of a young woman's life. The original investigators had worked with the tools available to them. They had interviewed people. They had followed leads. They had searched. They had examined Donna's disappearance. But the case eventually stalled. There were questions that could not be answered. There was evidence that could not provide an identity. There were suspicions that could not become charges. And time kept moving. The discovery of Donna's remains in 1995 changed the case forever. Before that moment, the family could still hope. After that moment, they had to grieve. But grief without an identified killer creates another kind of uncertainty. The person responsible could still be somewhere. He could still be alive. He could still have a family. He could still be living an ordinary life while Donna's family carried the consequences of what he had done. That possibility is one of the most painful realities of an unsolved homicide. The victim is gone. The family is left behind. And the person responsible may remain unknown. In Donna's case, investigators eventually learned that the suspect was not only alive during much of the investigation. He had already been identified as a person of interest. Nathaniel Harvey had existed within the case from its early years. But suspicion alone had not been enough. The investigation needed something stronger. That something eventually came from DNA. When investigators reopened the case, they returned to biological evidence from Donna's bedroom. The evidence had been collected decades earlier. Modern testing changed that. The DNA matched Harvey. Authorities said his DNA was the only DNA in the bedroom that should not have been there. That finding gave investigators a direct forensic connection that the original investigation had lacked. And that connection mattered more than ever, because Harvey was already dead. He could not be questioned. He could not be confronted. He could not offer an explanation. The evidence had to speak without him.
It did.
The result was not a dramatic revelation from a mysterious letter. It was not a confession discovered in an old notebook. It was not a stranger walking into a police station. It was science, a biological trace preserved through decades of uncertainty. That is why the breakthrough was so powerful. It showed how a case could remain unsolved even when important evidence had survived. The problem was not always that investigators had nothing. Sometimes they had something. They simply did not yet know what it meant. The DNA evidence had been present long before the technology could turn it into an identification. And when the technology caught up, the evidence pointed toward the same man whose name had already appeared in the old investigation. Nathaniel Harvey. That convergence was devastating, because it meant the answer had been closer than anyone wanted to believe. The case had not been solved by discovering an entirely new suspect. It had been solved by finally establishing the connection between the evidence and a person investigators had already considered. That distinction is important. It shows why cold cases can remain unresolved for decades. A detective may know who they want to question. They may believe that person is suspicious. They may even have circumstantial evidence. But the criminal justice system demands more. It demands proof. And without proof, a theory remains a theory. For Donna's family, that distinction meant years of waiting. They did not have the luxury of treating the case as an intellectual puzzle. This was personal. Donna was their daughter, their sister, someone they remembered before she became a photograph in a police file, someone whose voice they remembered, someone whose habits they remembered, someone who had been alive one day and gone the next. Her disappearance had changed the family permanently. And then, when her remains were found, the family had to change again. Hope was replaced by grief. But the grief had no final answer. There was still a name missing from the story. Who killed her? The answer would take decades. When investigators finally identified Harvey as responsible, the news could not restore the years lost. But it could remove the uncertainty. That mattered. It meant Donna's family no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be identified. They knew. The answer was official, and the investigation could finally explain how the case had reached its conclusion. There was another disturbing element. Harvey had died in prison in 2020. He had been serving a life sentence for another murder. That meant the final resolution of Donna's case came after the suspect's death. There would be no new arrest. No new trial. No additional prison sentence. The conventional image of justice could not happen. The investigators could only establish responsibility. For some families, that distinction is painful. A solved case and a punished killer are not always the same thing. Sometimes the truth arrives after the opportunity for prosecution has disappeared. That does not make the truth meaningless. It makes the truth even more important. Donna's family deserved to know. The community deserved to know. And the historical record deserved to be corrected. Donna was not simply a missing 19-year-old whose fate remained unknown. She was a homicide victim. Her killer had a name, and the evidence had survived long enough to establish it. The case also revealed how much can change when investigators refuse to accept that an old case is permanently dead. A cold case can look finished. The detectives may have exhausted every lead. The witnesses may have stopped producing information. The suspect may have disappeared. But evidence can remain. And evidence does not care how old the case is. DNA does not become irrelevant because a file has been sitting in storage for 30 years. A fingerprint does not lose its identity because investigators could not match it when it was collected. A physical trace can wait. The challenge is finding the technology and the investigators capable of interpreting it. Donna's case became a demonstration of that principle. The evidence had waited through the 1980s. It had waited through the 1990s. It had waited through the 2000s. It had waited through the 2010s. And even after Harvey died, it remained. Then investigators returned. They reopened the file. They examined the evidence again. They sent viable material for modern testing. And the past finally produced an answer. For the detectives working the reinvestigation, that moment must have carried an unusual weight. They were looking at evidence collected by investigators from another generation. Some of the original detectives were retired. Some may have been gone, but the work they had started remained. The old case file became a bridge between two eras of investigation. One generation had collected the evidence. Another generation learned how to use it. And Donna's name survived both. That is one reason cold case investigations matter beyond a single prosecution. They are promises that the passage of time will not automatically erase a victim's case. The investigation may slow. It may stop for years, but the possibility of reopening remains. Donna's case demonstrates why that matters. If the evidence had been discarded, the story might have ended differently. If the biological material had been unavailable, the connection might never have been made. If investigators had refused to revisit old assumptions, the case might have remained unresolved. Instead, they went back. They tested again. And they found the connection. The result was announced publicly in 2023, nearly 4 decades after Donna disappeared. The timeline itself is difficult to comprehend. A 19-year-old woman disappeared in 1984. Her remains were found in 1995. The suspect died in 2020. And the official identification came in 2023. A person's entire adult life could pass inside those dates. Children could be born. Families could grow. Cities could change. Technology could transform. And still, one question remained. Who killed Donna Macho? Now that question had an answer. Nathaniel Harvey. But there was still one thing the investigation could never provide. The final moments of Donna's life. No forensic test could reconstruct every second. No laboratory could reveal exactly what she was thinking. No detective could bring her back to the moment before everything changed. Those details were gone. That is the cruelest limit of cold case work. Investigators can sometimes identify the killer. They can sometimes reconstruct the timeline. They can sometimes determine how a victim died. But they cannot recover the life that was taken. Donna should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, her life became a case file. Her name became part of a missing person investigation, then a homicide investigation, then a cold case, and finally a solved case. But she was never merely a case. She was a person. That is why the ending should not be remembered only as a DNA breakthrough. The breakthrough matters. The science matters. The investigative work matters. But the reason any of it mattered was Donna, a young woman whose family refused to let her disappearance become forgotten. A family that kept searching when the years became unbearable. A sister who was only 14 when Donna vanished and who had to carry the uncertainty into adulthood. For those people, the investigation was never simply finished because the file went cold. The question remained alive. The pain remained alive. And eventually, the evidence produced an answer. It was not the answer anyone wanted, but it was the truth. Donna Macho had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Nathaniel Harvey was responsible. The evidence connecting him to the case had survived for decades. And the investigators who reopened the case were finally able to prove what earlier investigators could not. The silence had been broken, but it had taken almost 40 years. That is what makes the case so haunting. The killer did not confess. He did not return. He did not leave behind a final message. He simply died before the case was officially solved. The evidence outlived him. And in the end, the evidence became his voice. Not a human voice. Not an admission. Not an explanation. A forensic result. A scientific connection. A fact that remained long after memories faded. The case had begun with a young woman walking into the uncertainty of a February day in 1984. Her family waited. They searched. They hoped. Then they learned the worst. For decades after that, another question remained. Who had done it? The answer finally came from the past itself. The old evidence was still there. The old investigation had left traces. The technology had changed. And when investigators finally put those pieces together, the name that emerged was Nathaniel Harvey. The mystery was over. The loss was not. And perhaps that is the most important distinction of all. A cold case can be solved. A family can receive an answer. A killer can be identified. But a life cannot be restored. Donna remained 19 forever. The world moved on without her. Her family grew older. The suspect died. Yet her case continued waiting. Waiting for science. Waiting for someone to reopen the file. Waiting for someone to look again. And when they finally did, the evidence had not forgotten. Neither had Donna.